The world was made of dust and light. It rose from the earth in fine golden clouds, stirred by the rhythmic, percussive tramp of more than 40,000 pairs of caligae, the hobnailed sandals of the Roman legionary. Each step, taken in unison, was a heartbeat, the pulse of a living, breathing war machine that had ground nations to powder and redrawn the maps of the known world. This was the army of the Roman Republic, and to march in its ranks was to be a part of something eternal, something invincible. Here, on the sun-scorched plains of Syria, in the 53rd year before the birth of Christ, that feeling was more potent than ever. The air, thick with heat and the smell of sweat, leather, and hot metal, vibrated with a silent, arrogant confidence. This was the edge of the world they knew, and they had come to push it further. 7 legions. A force of such magnitude that its very presence warped the landscape. From a high vantage point, they were not men at all, but a single, serpentine creature of impossible scale, a river of steel and crimson flowing across the arid expanse. The sun, a merciless white disk in the vast cerulean sky, struck fire from their armor. Thousands of polished iron helmets, the Gallia threw back the light in blinding flashes. Their segmented armor, the larica segmentata, shifted and articulated with the steady, rolling gait of the march, each plate catching the sun in a continuous, dazzling ripple. Above this river of metal, a forest of spears, the pila, stood erect, their sharpened points aimed at the heavens as if to challenge the gods themselves. And above it all, held aloft with a sacred reverence, were the eagles, the aquilae. They were not mere standards. They were the soul of each legion, cast in silver and gold, their wings outstretched in a permanent state of glorious aggression. Each eagle represented the honor, the spirit, and the divine favor of Rome. To lose one was a shame so profound, it could lead to the disbandment of an entire legion, a disgrace that would haunt generations. The aquilifers who carried them were men of immense pride and proven courage, their faces set like stone, their gaze fixed forward. They marched with the weight of Rome's majesty on their shoulders, and the sunlight that glinted from their eagles' eyes seemed to promise nothing but victory. This was the tangible manifestation of power, a promise of dominion forged in the fires of countless wars. The men who marched beneath these eagles felt it in their bones. They were the inheritors of a legacy of conquest, from the misty forests of Gaul to the sun-beaten shores of Africa. They were Romans. The world was theirs for the taking. The sound of the army was a symphony of power. It was the endless, unified crunch of sandals on gravel and baked earth. It was the soft, rhythmic creak of tens of thousands of leather straps, the gentle clatter of sword hilts against iron plate, the jingle of gear. It was the low murmur of conversation, a thousand quiet jokes and complaints spoken in the rough, colloquial Latin of the barracks, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the sheer scale of the march. Occasionally, a centurion's voice would cut through the haze, sharp and commanding, correcting a man's posture or urging a lagging section forward. These were the non-commissioned officers, the hardened backbone of the legions, men whose faces were maps of old campaigns, scarred and tanned by foreign suns. They moved with a purpose that bordered on predatory, their helmet crests, set transversely, marking them as pillars of discipline in the flowing river of men. For the common legionary, life on the march was a grueling, monotonous reality, yet it was a reality infused with a sense of grand purpose. They were professionals, not conscripts. Many were veterans of other campaigns, their bodies hardened by years of training and battle. They carried their world on their backs. The sarsenat, a heavy pack containing their rations of hardtack and sour wine, a cooking pot, a shovel, stakes for the nightly construction of a fortified camp, and a few personal trinkets, a carved wooden idol, a letter from a wife in Italy, a worn coin for luck. The weight was immense, a constant, grinding burden under the Syrian sun, but they bore it with a practiced stoicism. Their thoughts were simple, immediate concerns, the next source of water, the quality of the evening's rations, the dull ache in their shoulders, the blisters forming on their feet. Yet even in their weariness, they could not escape the intoxicating aura of the campaign. They were marching east, into the fabled lands of Parthia, a kingdom spoken of in whispers and legends. It was a place of silk and spice, of unimaginable wealth hoarded in ancient cities. The stories told in the flickering firelight of the camps were of mountains of gold and rivers of pearls. This was not a war for survival or for the defense of the Republic. This was a war for plunder. Every man from the lowest legionary to the highest-ranking officer dreamed of the riches that awaited them. They envisioned returning to their farms or city tenements as wealthy men, their fortunes made in a single, glorious campaign. This shared dream was a powerful motivator, a balm for their aching muscles and parched throats. It turned the dust they kicked up into motes of gold, the harsh sun into a promise of the glittering treasures of the East. The landscape itself was an alien presence. It was a world of muted colors, ochre tan and pale brown, stretching to a horizon that shimmered and danced in the heat. The familiar green hills of Italy were a distant memory, replaced by a vast, unforgiving emptiness. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the sound of their own passage. There were no birds singing, no rustle of leaves in the wind. There was only the sun, the dust, and the army. This emptiness should have been intimidating, a warning of the desolation that lay ahead. But to the Romans, it was merely a blank canvas upon which they would paint their victory. They saw not a wasteland, but an arena. They were the greatest army in the world, marching into a void that they would soon fill with the glory of Rome. Their confidence was absolute, a shield as strong as the curved scutum they carried. They were unbeatable, not just because of their training, their discipline, or their numbers, but because they believed it. It was the central, unshakable truth of their existence. The world had always yielded to the tramp of their feet, and this new, empty part of it would be no different. The river of steel and red cloaks flowed on, its destination a foregone conclusion, its victory already written in the stars, or so they thought. The dust they raised settled behind them, momentarily obscuring their path, a fine golden veil that hid the future and erased the past, leaving only the relentless, confident, and ultimately doomed present, **** at the heart of this immense, flowing river of men. Insulated from the dust and the common misery of the march, rode Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was a man in his 60s, his body beginning to betray the softness of a life lived in palatial comfort. Yet his eyes burned with the fierce, unquenched ambition of a youth. He was not a natural soldier like Caesar, whose name was forged in the bloody mud of Gaul, nor was he a beloved public hero like Pompey the Great, who had swept the Mediterranean clean of pirates and celebrated triumphs that dazzled the Roman populace. Crassus's fame, his power, was built on a different, more tangible foundation: gold. He was, by a measure so vast it was almost incomprehensible, the richest man in Rome. His wealth was a legend, an empire of its own, built on shrewd real estate speculation, silver mines, and a network of enterprises that touched every corner of the Republic. He owned so much of Rome that it was said he could walk from one end of the city to the other without ever stepping off his own property. But wealth, he had discovered, was not enough. It bought influence, it bought fear, it bought armies, but it did not buy the one thing his soul craved with a desperate, gnawing hunger: gloria. True, everlasting glory. The kind that was etched into the annals of history, celebrated in song and stone, and whispered with reverence for centuries. That kind of glory, the highest currency in the Roman world, was earned only in one place: the battlefield. It was won with blood, steel, and the subjugation of foreign peoples. And in the towering shadows of his political rivals, Caesar and Pompey, Crassus felt his own legacy shrinking. He was the third man in the triumvirate, the financier, the necessary but unglamorous partner. While they returned to Rome with laurel wreaths on their heads, parading captive kings and captured treasures through the streets, Crassus managed accounts and political favors. The applause for them was thunderous, genuine, born of awe. The respect for him was transactional, born of debt. This Parthian campaign was to be his corrective, his masterpiece. It was his bid for immortality, a chance to finally carve his own name into the bedrock of Roman history, equal to, and perhaps even surpassing, his rivals. His eyes, when they gazed eastward, did not see the harsh, unforgiving desert that stretched before his legions. They saw a stage. They saw the fabled, unconquered lands of the Orient, a place where Alexander the Great himself had won eternal fame. Parthia was the last great untapped source of military glory available to a Roman general. To conquer it would be a feat of legendary proportions. He imagined his return to Rome, not as a politician, but as a conqueror. He envisioned the triumphal arch that would be built in his honor, its marble reliefs depicting his legions crushing the exotic silk-clad armies of the East. He could almost hear the roar of the crowd in the forum, a sound that all his gold could not purchase. His ambition was a fire in his gut, and it made him deaf to the warnings of caution. In the Senate, there had been voices of dissent. Parthia had not provoked Rome. There was no casus belli, no just cause for war. This was a campaign of naked aggression, fueled by personal vanity. The tribunes had even attempted to place a curse on him as he departed the city, a dark and ominous piece of political theater, but Crassus had brushed it all aside. He saw their objections not as wise counsel, but as the jealous machinations of lesser men who sought to keep him confined to the world of finance. He had Pompey's tacit support and Caesar's distant approval. With the power of the triumvirate behind him, the grumblings of the Senate were meaningless. He had funded this expedition himself, raising and equipping the 7 legions with his own vast fortune. They were, in a very real sense, his army, and he would lead them to a victory so total, so enriching, that it would silence all his critics forever. Riding in his ornate litter, carried by strong Cappadocian slaves, he was shielded from the worst of the sun's glare. He would study maps, scrolls of Herodotus and Xenophon, trying to glean some insight into the lands he was about to invade. But his study was superficial. He was not a strategist by nature. He was a speculator. He saw the world in terms of risk and reward, and in Parthia he saw a reward so immense that any risk seemed acceptable. His generals, like the capable and experienced Cassius Longinus, urged a more cautious approach. They advised him to follow the course of the Euphrates River, to keep the army supplied with water, and to secure the Greek cities of Mesopotamia as allies, establishing a solid base of operations before plunging into the unknown interior. With sound military doctrine, the Roman way of war, methodical, patient, and inexorable. But Crassus was impatient. The river route was slow, a meandering path that would delay his confrontation with the enemy, and with it, his glory. He was not a young man. He did not have years to spend on a slow, grinding campaign of attrition. He wanted a swift, decisive battle. He wanted to shatter the Parthian army in a single, glorious engagement, march on their capital Ctesiphon, and seize the legendary treasury of the Arsacid kings. His hunger for this outcome made him susceptible to convenient lies. When an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes arrived in his camp, presenting himself as a friend of Rome and an enemy of the Parthians, Crassus listened with rapt attention. Ariam spoke of a Parthian army in disarray, of a king who was weak and unprepared. He told Crassus that the main Parthian force was far away, and that if the Romans struck now, marching directly across the desert, they could catch the enemy completely by surprise. It was exactly what Crassus wanted to hear. The story fit the narrative he had already written in his own mind. Cassius and his other officers were deeply suspicious of this smooth-tongued desert chief, recognizing the classic signs of a trap. They saw the glint of deception in Ariamnes' eyes and begged Crassus not to trust him, to stick to the safe, proven strategy. But their pleas were in vain. Crassus's ambition had become a form of blindness. He saw caution as cowardice and suspicion as a lack of faith in his destiny. He chose to believe the man who promised him a shortcut to his dreams. And so, with a wave of his hand and a command born of hubris, he turned his entire army away from the life-giving waters of the Euphrates and ordered them to march directly east, into the heart of the wasteland. He was following a phantom, a promise of glory whispered by a traitor, his eyes fixed on a prize that existed only in his imagination. The richest man in Rome was leading his legions into a void, betting his life, the lives of 40,000 men, and the honor of the Republic on the conviction that his desire for glory could bend reality to its will. The decision to turn away from the river did not go unnoticed by the common soldiers. For a legionary, a river was life. It was water for their canteens, a defensive barrier for their nightly camps, and a clear, undeniable line of supply and retreat. To leave it was to step off the map, to voluntarily place oneself in the hands of fate. A low murmur of unease rippled through the ranks, a subtle shift in the army's mood, as tangible as a change in the wind. The centurions, ever vigilant, moved to suppress it, their voices sharp, reminding the men of their duty and the virtue of obedience. But the disquiet lingered, a seed of doubt planted in the dry, cracked earth of the Syrian desert. To counter this nascent fear, the army's spirit had to be fed another, more powerful emotion. Greed. The campaign, from its very inception, had been marketed to the soldiers not as a solemn duty to the Republic, but as a grand, speculative venture. This was not a war against a threatening Gallic chieftain or a rebellious Spanish tribe. It was an invasion of a mythical land, a place that shimmered in the Roman imagination with an almost supernatural luster. The recruiters in Italy had not spoken of hardship and sacrifice. They had spoken of treasure. They painted pictures of a kingdom so decadent that its nobles wore silk threaded with gold, where even common soldiers carried silver daggers, and where the temples were filled with idols of solid precious metal. These stories, embellished with each retelling, became the fuel that propelled the army forward, a potent intoxicant against the harsh realities of the march. In the evenings, as the legions methodically constructed their fortified campa, perfect square of ditches and ramparts, a temporary Rome built in the wilderness, each night the whispers would begin. Around the flickering campfires, the men would trade rumors and fantasies. One soldier, a veteran of Lucullus's earlier, more successful campaigns in the east, would swear he had seen a Parthian envoy whose horse was shod with silver. Another would recount a merchant's tale of a city called Ecbatana, where the roofs of the houses were tiled with gold. They spoke of the Parthian king's treasury, a hoard so vast it was said to contain the accumulated wealth of the old Persian Empire, a prize that would make every single man in the army rich beyond his wildest dreams. They calculated their potential shares, their voices low and excited, dividing up a treasure they had not yet seen, from an enemy they had not yet fought. This pervasive atmosphere of avarice was a deliberate strategy, nurtured from the top down. Crassus himself, in his rare addresses to the troops, spoke less of Roman honor and more of Parthian gold. He presented the campaign as a straightforward transaction, their courage and discipline in exchange for a fortune. He promised them riches that would allow them to buy the finest farms in Campania, to live out their days in comfort and luxury, their children never knowing a day of want. It was a powerful promise, for these were not, by and large, men of noble birth. They were farmers, laborers, and the urban poor of Rome, men for whom a life of grinding poverty was the only certain inheritance. The idea of transforming their fortunes through a single, successful war was a dream of intoxicating power. It made them complicit in Crassus's ambition. His greed became their own. The officers, too, were caught up in the fever. While the common soldier dreamed of a sack of gold coins and a small plot of land, the tribunes and legates dreamed on a grander scale. They envisioned vast estates, political careers funded by Eastern plunder, and a life of aristocratic ease. They saw the captured artworks, the fine silks, the exotic slaves that would adorn their villas in Rome. This campaign was their opportunity to join the ranks of the super-wealthy, to elevate their family names for generations. This shared lust for wealth created a strange, almost feverish energy in the command tent. Strategic discussions were often colored by calculations of potential loot. The quickest path to the Parthian capital, Ctesiphon, was favored not just for military reasons, but because it was the location of the royal treasury. The war was subtly reframed as a treasure hunt, and the legions were the key to unlocking the prize. This focus on plunder had a corrosive effect on military prudence. It fostered impatience and encouraged risk-taking. The slow, methodical Roman way of war securing territory, building supply lines, gathering intelligence was seen as an impediment, a tedious delay before the great payday. Why bother with the difficult siege of a fortified border town when the real wealth lay in the heart of the kingdom, supposedly undefended? Why spend months winning the allegiance of local tribes when a single, decisive battle could deliver the entire kingdom into their hands? The entire strategic calculus of the campaign was warped by the glittering prize that Crassus had dangled before their eyes. The war was no longer about subjugating an enemy state. It was about cracking open its vault. The soldiers, driven by these visions of wealth, began to see the land around them not as a hostile environment to be respected, but as a mere obstacle, separating them from their reward. They pushed themselves harder, marching longer hours under the brutal sun, their endurance fueled by dreams of gold. The growing scarcity of water, the poor quality of the forage for the baggage animals, the unnerving emptiness of the landscape, all these warning signs were mentally downplayed, dismissed as temporary hardships on the road to riches. They had placed their faith in Crassus not just as a general, but as a financial patron. His legendary wealth was to them proof of his acumen. A man who could amass such a personal fortune, they reasoned, surely knew how to acquire more. They trusted his judgment, believing that his Midas touch would extend to this military venture. But a campaign built on greed is a fragile thing. Its foundations are not loyalty, nor duty, nor patriotism, but the promise of personal gain. Such an army is strong only as long as the prospect of that gain seems certain and imminent. It lacks the resilience to endure true soul-crushing hardship. Its morale is a bubble, easily pricked by the sharp point of reality. As the legions marched deeper into the desert, led by their treacherous guide, they were marching away from more than just the river. They were marching away from the solid, dependable principles of Roman warfare and into a moral and strategic void, a place where the only compass point was the glint of imaginary gold on the horizon. The whispers around the campfires continued, but a new, unspoken question began to hang in the hot, still air. What if the stories weren't true? What if the gold was harder to win than they had been told? What if the price of this treasure was not just sweat and discipline, but blood and annihilation? For now, the dream was enough. But the desert is a place of harsh awakenings, and the bill for a war of avarice was about to come due. Asterisk, of course. Here's the fourth section of the script. Section 4. A desert mirage. The world had bleached itself of color. The ochre and tan of the Syrian plains had given way to a landscape of shimmering, featureless white. The sun, no longer a distant disk, felt like a physical weight, pressing down from a sky that was no longer blue but a pale, hazy glare. The heat was an enemy, an active, malevolent force that rose in waves from the baked earth, stealing the moisture from a man's throat before he could swallow, and turning the iron of his helmet into a branding iron. The rhythmic tramp of the legions had lost its confident, percussive edge. It was now a slow, dragging shuffle, the sound of 40,000 men locked in a grim, personal battle against exhaustion and thirst. The dream of gold had not vanished, but it had receded, replaced by a more primal, desperate dream. The dream of water. At the head of the column, riding near Crassus, was the architect of this misery, Ariamnes, the Arab chieftain. He remained an island of calm in the sea of Roman suffering. Dressed in flowing robes that seemed to shed the heat, he rode his desert-bred horse with an easy grace, his face a mask of serene confidence. He would point towards the shimmering horizon, his voice smooth and reassuring, promising that a fertile, well-watered valley lay just ahead, a few more hours of marching at most. The Parthians, he insisted, were nowhere to be seen, completely oblivious to the Roman advance. He was a master of his craft, playing on Crassus's impatience and vanity with the skill of a master musician. The Roman officers, especially the quaestor, Cassius Longinus, watched him with open hostility. They saw the lie in his eyes, the subtle, almost imperceptible curl of his lip as he watched the legions toil. They saw how his gaze would occasionally dart to the flanks, scanning the empty horizon with an attention that was too keen for a simple guide. Cassius, a man whose instincts had been honed in a dozen campaigns, repeatedly approached Crassus, his voice low and urgent. "He is leading us into a trap. Marcus," he would plead. No friend of Rome would lead us into such a wasteland. Let us turn back to the river before it is too late. Let us establish a secure position. This man is a traitor. But Crassus, his judgment, clouded by his desperate need for this campaign to be a swift success, waved the warnings away with an irritable flick of his wrist. To admit that Ariamnes was a traitor would be to admit his own catastrophic error. In judgment, it would mean turning back in failure. His shortcut to glory revealed as a fool's errand. His pride, as vast and unyielding as the desert itself, would not allow it. He chose to see Cassius's pragmatism as pessimism, his caution as an attempt to undermine his authority. "Your courage fails you, Cassius," Crassus retorted, his voice sharp. "The men see your fear. We are Romans. Do not fear, little son. We press on." And so they pressed on, deeper into the killing ground that had been prepared for them. The local guides, the men Ariamnes had provided, were phantoms. They spoke little, their faces weathered and unreadable, their eyes as empty as the landscape. They were part of the mirage, human props in a grand deception. They would confer with Ariamnes in a language the Romans could not understand, their quiet conversation lost in the hot wind. Then, with a final reassuring nod to Crassus, Ariamnes would slip away, promising to scout ahead, to harass any patrols he might find. He melted back into the desert from which he had come, his departure so seamless it was as if he had been a hallucination all along. The guides he left behind now led the army with a sullen, mechanical obedience. Their purpose served. The landscape itself became a form of psychological torture. The horizon shimmered and danced with phantom lakes, cruel illusions of cool, clear water that would vanish upon approach, leaving only more cracked earth and shimmering heat. The sun played tricks on the eyes, turning distant rock formations into waiting armies and dust devils into cavalry patrols. The men's thirst became a maddening obsession. Their tongues were thick and swollen, their lips cracked and bleeding. The meager water ration, warm and tasting of the leather skins it was carried in, was a momentary relief that only seemed to intensify the craving that followed. The silence of the desert was absolute, a heavy, pressing void that was more unnerving than the clash of arms. It felt as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the legionaries. The reality of their situation was beginning to dawn. The whispers around the fires at night were no longer of gold, but of survival. They looked at their centurions, their faces grim and set, and saw their own fears reflected there. The discipline held, but it was the brittle discipline of professionals, who knew they were in a desperate situation, not the arrogant swagger of conquerors. They were a river that had been diverted into a basin of sand, and they could feel their strength, their very life force, seeping away into the ground beneath their feet. They had marched into a trap not of steel, but of geography. They were isolated, exhausted, and dehydrated, miles from safety, in a land chosen by their enemy. Then a report came from the forward scouts. A real report, not a mirage. They had found tracks, not the tracks of a few scattered patrols, but of a vast host of cavalry. The ground was churned up for miles, evidence of thousands of horses. The enemy was not in disarray. The enemy was not far away. The enemy was here, and they had been waiting. The news spread through the column like a contagion, confirming the dark premonitions that had haunted the army for days. The mirage of an easy victory evaporated in an instant, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a battle for survival. Crassus, his face pale, finally understood the depth of the betrayal. He had not led his men on a shortcut to glory, but on a death march. The unreadable faces of the local guides now made perfect sense. They were not guides, they were jailers, and they had just delivered the prisoners to the executioner. The news of the cavalry tracks fell upon the legions like a physical blow. The weary shuffling of 40,000 men faltered, the rhythm of the march broken for the first time by a wave of collective apprehension. A new sound entered the symphony of the army, the clatter of shields being adjusted, the rasp of swords being checked in their scabbards, the low, anxious murmurings of men whose worst fears were solidifying into a terrifying reality. The heat, the thirst, the crushing weight of their garral of it was momentarily forgotten, eclipsed by a primal, electric surge of adrenaline. The trap, once a suspicion whispered by cautious officers, was now sprung. The featureless desert no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Watching coiled Crassus, his face a mask of disbelief turning to dread, ordered the army to halt and form a preliminary battle line. The commands of the centurions, sharp and guttural, cut through the air, their authority a comforting anchor in the rising sea of uncertainty. The men, despite their exhaustion, responded with the ingrained muscle memory of their training. Ranks were dressed, cohorts aligned, and the long, vulnerable marching column began to transform itself into a wide, solid rectangle of shields and spears, the classic Roman hollow square, designed to repel attacks from all directions. It was a formation of defense, not of conquest. In that single tactical shift, the entire nature of the campaign was laid bare. The hunters had become the hunted. The officers scanned the horizon, their hands shielding their eyes against the blinding glare. The guides, their purpose fulfilled, had vanished. They had not fled in a panic, but had simply melted away into the landscape that had birthed them, leaving the Romans utterly alone in the vast, silent arena. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. The silence pressed in, amplifying the thumping of every man's heart. The sun beat down, the heat shimmered, the world seemed to be holding its breath. The soldiers stood in their ranks, sweating under the weight of their armor, their knuckles white where they gripped their pila. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow-burning fire of anticipation and dread. Then, they saw it, it began. Not as a clear image, but as a distortion on the eastern horizon. It was a shimmering, a subtle disturbance in the air, like the heat haze rising from a fire, but it was too vast, too uniform. It looked like a low-lying cloud, strange and dark, against the pale earth, but it was not a cloud. It did not drift, it advanced. It grew steadily, resolving itself not into vapor, but into something solid, something alive. It was a cloud of dust, but a dust cloud of impossible size, kicked up by the hooves of thousands upon thousands of horses. It was the breath of the approaching beast. As it drew nearer, the shimmering resolved into individual points of light, countless tiny sparks that glittered and flashed in the sunlight. It was the sun glinting off polished metal, but not the familiar iron of a Roman legion. This was different. It was the brilliant, almost blinding reflection from the armor of the Parthian heavy cavalry. The legendary, they were spoken of in fearful whispers by merchants and travelers, described as specters of war, men and horses fused into a single terrifying entity of steel and bronze. The legionaries, who had never seen such a foe, could only stare, a knot of cold fear tightening in their stomachs. This was not some barbarian horde of screaming half-naked warriors they were used to fighting in Gaul or Germania. This was something else entirely. This was an army from a different world. The sheer scale of the approaching force was staggering. It seemed to have no flanks, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other, a moving wall of dust and light that threatened to swallow the landscape. The Romans, for all their numbers, suddenly felt small, an isolated island in the path of a tidal wave. The confidence that had sustained them for months, the ingrained belief in their own invincibility, began to crack. They looked at the eagle standards, the golden souls of their legions, and for the first time, they seemed not like symbols of inevitable victory, but like fragile, lonely totems in a vast and hostile wilderness. Crassus, his face ashen, rode along the lines, shouting words of encouragement that sounded hollow even to his own ears. He spoke of Roman valor, of the discipline that had conquered the world, of the rewards that still awaited them. But his words were snatched away by the hot wind, lost in the face of the terrifying spectacle unfolding before them. The men listened, but their eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the inexorably advancing cloud. They were professional soldiers, and they would stand and fight. It was their trade, their duty. But the arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the grim, fatalistic resolve of men who understood they were trapped. The desert they had so arrogantly entered had finally revealed its true nature. It was not an empty arena for their glory. It was a tomb, and its guardians had arrived. The shimmering cloud was no longer a distant threat. It was their destiny. Riding towards them on a storm of dust and steel. Suggested new knowledge. 749 of course. Here is the 6th section of the script. Section 6. The thunder of the drums. The shimmering cloud of dust and light was now close enough to resolve into its terrifying components, a sea of horsemen. But as the visual threat grew clearer, a new assault began, one aimed not at the body, but at the very soul of the Roman army. It started as a low guttural vibration, a tremor felt more in the bones and the soles of the feet than heard with the ear. It was a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a sinister pulse that grew steadily in intensity, synchronizing with the frantic, fearful beating of the soldiers' hearts. The legionaries exchanged uneasy glances, their hands tightening on their weapons. This was not a sound of war they recognized. It was not the blare of a Roman cornu or the wild, chaotic war cries of a Gallic tribe. This was something alien, something deeply unsettling. Then, the sound swelled, rising from a subterranean tremor into a deafening, world-consuming roar. It was the sound of the Parthian kettle drums, great hollow bronze drums, some so large they had to be mounted on the backs of camels, who were being beaten with a relentless, rhythmic fury. The sound was immense, a physical force that hammered against the Roman shields, vibrated through their helmets, and seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. It was not music. It was a weapon. It was a deep, booming, thunderous cacophony, designed to disorient, to terrify, to shatter the disciplined cohesion that was the bedrock of Roman military power. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once, a rolling wave of noise that echoed off the hard-pan desert floor and the dome of the sky, creating a disorienting, claustrophobic bubble of pure, mind-numbing sound. For the Roman soldier, discipline was auditory. It was the sharp, clear bark of a centurion's command, the familiar blast of the horn signaling a maneuver, the unified tramp of thousands of feet. It was a world of predictable, orderly sounds that reinforced the structure and hierarchy of the legion. This Parthian thunder was the antithesis of that order. It was chaos given voice. It swallowed the commands of the officers, making it impossible to hear orders from more than a few feet away. a centurion would open his mouth to shout, his face contorted with effort. But his words would be instantly devoured by the overwhelming din. The auditory fabric that held the legion together was being torn to shreds. The psychological effect was devastating. The relentless, booming rhythm was primal, bypassing the rational mind of the trained soldier and striking directly at the ancient, instinctual fears of the man. It felt like the sound of an earthquake, of a world coming apart. It induced a state of profound anxiety, a feeling of being overwhelmed and powerless. The soldiers, unable to hear their officers, or even their own thoughts, felt suddenly, terrifyingly alone, despite being packed shoulder to shoulder with their comrades. Each man was an island in an ocean of terrifying noise. The constant, percussive assault frayed their nerves, making them jumpy and reactive. The disciplined stoicism of the professional legionary began to crumble, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. The Parthians were masters of this psychological warfare. They understood that a battle is won in the mind before it is won on the field. As the drums thundered, their army continued its slow, deliberate advance, allowing the full weight of the auditory assault to settle upon the Romans. The legionaries could only stand and endure it, trapped within their defensive square, the noise a cage as real as any made of iron bars. They tried to brace themselves to set their jaws and focus on the enemy, but the sound was insidious. It crept into the skull, rattled the teeth, and turned the stomach. It was the sound of impending doom, a funeral dirge for an army that was still alive. Crassus, utterly unprepared for such a tactic, was visibly shaken. He rode frantically behind the lines, his mouth moving, trying to shout encouragement, but he was just another silent actor in a play dominated by the hellish soundtrack. He could see the fear in his men's eyes, the way their discipline was fraying at the edges. The confidence he had tried to project just moments before was now a laughable memory. His army, the pride of the Republic, was being unmanned by sound. He had read the histories of Alexander, the treatises on tactics, but no scroll in any Roman library had prepared him for this. This was a form of war that was ancient, elemental, and terrifyingly effective. The visual spectacle compounded the terror. The Parthian horsemen, still just outside of bowshot, began to perform slow, menacing maneuvers. The cataphracts, gleaming in their scale armor, moved with a ponderous, inexorable grace. Their lances, held high, the horse archers, nimble and unarmored, swirled around them in fluid, unpredictable patterns. It was all perfectly synchronized to the booming of the drums, a choreographed dance of death. They were not rushing into a chaotic charge. They were putting on a performance, a terrifying display of power and control designed to maximize the psychological impact before a single arrow was loosed. For the Roman legionaries, standing in their rigid formation, this was an entirely new and terrifying experience. They were accustomed to the enemy charging them, to meeting that charge with a volley of pila and the unshakable wall of their shields. They were masters of that brutal close-quarters exchange. But this enemy would not close. They remained at a distance, a shimmering, untouchable threat, content to let their drums do the initial bloody work on the Romans' courage. The air grew thick not just with heat and dust, but with a palpable tension, a sense of dread so thick, it was almost suffocating. The world had been reduced to two things: the terrifying, silent vision of the approaching army, and the all-consuming, mind-shattering thunder of their drums. The battle had begun, not with the clash of steel, but with the breaking of the Roman mind. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the thunder of the kettledrums ceased. The abrupt, shocking silence that followed was almost as disorienting as the noise itself. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the world was utterly still. The ears of the Roman soldiers rang with the ghost of the phantom rhythm, and in that ringing silence, they heard a new sound. It was not loud or booming, but it was a sound that every soldier in the world knew and dreaded. It was a dry, sharp, collective twang, the sound of 10,000 bowstrings being loosed in near-perfect unison. The Parthian horse archers, who had been swirling like vultures on the periphery, suddenly spurred their mounts forward. They were masters of a technique that was anathema to the Roman way of war. They did not charge into contact. They rode at a gallop in a wide, sweeping arc, just at the edge of the effective range of a Roman pilum. As they rode, they twisted in their saddles with a breathtaking agility, drawing and loosing their powerful composite bows with a speed and fluidity that seemed supernatural. They were the embodiment of mobile warfare, a phantom-like force that refused to offer a solid target. For a moment, the Romans watched, transfixed by this display of alien horsemanship. Then, the sky went dark. The first volley of arrows, loosed at a high angle, reached the apex of its trajectory and began its descent. It was not a scattered shower, it was a blanket, a solid, hissing, whispering sheet of death that blotted out the sun. The soldiers instinctively raised their shields. The command, testudo or klepios, screaming from the centurions, though the order was hardly needed. The curved rectangular scuta slammed together, forming a shell of overlapping wood and leather, a desperate attempt to create a haven in the heart of the storm. The sound of the volley striking the shield wall was not the clean thud of a single impact. It was a deafening, percussive roar, like 1,000 hailstones the size of fists hammering on a wooden roof. It was the sound of a world being torn apart by countless small impacts. The force was staggering. Shields expertly crafted to deflect sword blows and spear thrusts were subjected to a form of punishment for which they were not designed. The Parthian arrows were not simple shafts. They were heavy, with long three-bladed armor-piercing heads forged from hardened iron. They were designed not just to wound, but to penetrate. They punched through the thick layers of wood and leather of the scudo with sickening ease. A legionary would feel the heavy impact on his shield, a jarring shock that ran up his arm, and then a moment later, a searing white-hot pain, as the arrowhead, having passed completely through the shield, buried itself deep in his shoulder, his arm, or his chest. Men screamed, their cries of agony instantly lost in the cacophony of the ongoing volley. They fell, pulling their shields down with them, creating momentary gaps in the defensive shell. Gaps that were instantly exploited by the next wave of arrows. The ground inside the Roman square became a scene of hellish carnage. Men lay thrashing, their own shields pinning them to the ground, the feathered shafts of arrows protruding from their bodies. The arrows came from such a high angle that they struck everywhere. They pierced helmets, drove through the leather, straps of armor, and found the vulnerable gaps at the neck and under the arms. They slammed into legs and feet, nailing men to the very ground they were trying to defend. The disciplined Roman ranks, the source of their strength, now became a death trot. The men were packed so tightly together that they could not maneuver, could not escape. They could only stand, or kneel, and endure the relentless, vertical rain of steel, and the storm did not cease. The Parthians had organized their attack with terrifying efficiency. They fought in relays. As one rank of horse archers expended their quivers, they would peel off and retreat at speed, while a fresh rank rode forward to take their place. Behind the lines a vast supply train of camels, thousands of them, was laden with nothing but arrows. This was not a battle of finite ammunition. The Parthians had brought enough arrows to sustain the storm for hours. The Romans were facing an inexhaustible deluge of death. The legionaries, trapped and helpless, could do nothing in return. The enemy never came within range of their heavy throwing spears. A few desperate volleys of pila were thrown, but the heavy javelins fell harmlessly short, swallowed by the desert, while the untouchable horsemen simply swirled away, loosing their own deadly shafts as they retreated. It was the ultimate frustration. The Roman legionary was a creature of the close-quarters fight, a master of the short, stabbing gladius. His entire training was predicated on closing with the enemy and destroying him face to face. But here, his greatest strength was rendered useless. He could not charge the enemy. They were too fast. He could not throw his javelin at them. They were too far. He was reduced from a proud, aggressive soldier to a static target, a helpless victim in a one-sided execution. The first wave had hit, and it was not a wave of men to be fought, but a storm to be weathered. And it was a storm that showed no sign of ever-ending. The Roman square, once a proud bastion of discipline, was becoming a slaughterhouse. The relentless storm of arrows was taking a horrific toll, not just on the bodies of the men, but on their morale. The stoic endurance of the professional soldier was cracking under the strain of a battle where they could not fight back. The air was thick with the screams of the wounded and the sickening, percussive thud of arrows finding their mark. Crassus, riding frantically within the hollow square, his face a mask of horror and indecision, knew that something had to be done. To simply stand and absorb this punishment was to accept a slow, agonizing annihilation. The army's spirit was bleeding out into the sand, faster than the blood of its wounded. At his side was his son, Publius Licinius Crassus. He was everything his father was not. Young, handsome, and a genuinely gifted cavalry commander, Publius had earned his reputation not through wealth, but through valor. He had served with distinction under Julius Caesar in Gaul, leading the cavalry with a flair and courage that had won him Caesar's personal admiration. He was adored by the men under his command, a force of 1,000 Gallic horsemen, who had followed him from the green fields of their homeland to this forsaken desert, their loyalty to him absolute. Unlike his father, who saw this campaign as a path to political glory, Publius saw it as a matter of honor and duty. Now, watching the legions being cut to pieces from a distance, his warrior spirit could bear it no longer. He spurred his horse to his father's side, his voice cutting through the din with youthful fire and desperation. "Father, we cannot stay here and die like this. The men are breaking. Give me the cavalry. Let me charge them. Let me break their circle and give the legions a chance to breathe." It was a plea born of courage, but also of a profound misunderstanding of the enemy they faced. Publius was a product of European warfare, accustomed to battles that were decided by the shock of a heavy cavalry charge. A single, decisive moment of violent collision that shattered enemy formations. He saw the swirling Parthian horse archers as skirmishers, a screen that needed to be punched through to disrupt their attack. Crassus, seeing the fire in his son's eyes and desperate for any solution, any glimmer of hope to reverse the tide of disaster, made a fateful decision. He looked at his son, his heart a mixture of pride and terror, and he gave the order. "Go, my son," he commanded, his voice thick with emotion. Go and drive them off. Avenge the men they have slain. The Republic is watching. He detached 1,300 cavalry, including Publius's 1,000 elite Gauls, along with 500 foot archers and 8 cohorts of legionaries, nearly 5,000 men in total to support the charge. It was a significant portion of his army, a desperate gamble to change the momentum of the battle. The order was given. A section of the Roman square opened, a gate in the wall of shields, and Publius formed his men. The Gallic horsemen, huge, fierce men, on powerful chargers, were eager for the fight. They were warriors who lived for the thrill of the charge, and the static, defensive posture had been as torturous for them as it was for the legionaries. At their head, Publius was a magnificent sight, his armor polished, his scarlet cloak flowing behind him, the very image of a heroic Roman aristocrat. He raised his sword, its blade catching the merciless sun, and his voice roared with a command that was pure, unadulterated aggression. With a thunderous cry, they charged. The ground shook as 1,300 horses surged forward. A wedge of steel and fury aimed directly at the heart of the swirling Parthian lines. For the first time that day, the Romans were on the attack. A great cheer went up from the beleaguered legions in the square, a sound of desperate hope. They watched as their comrades galloped across the sand, a torrent of righteous vengeance unleashed. The Parthian horse archers, seeing the charge coming, did something unexpected. They did not stand their ground, nor did they panic. They simply parted with effortless grace. They feigned a retreat, their nimble horses easily outpacing the heavier Gallic chargers. They seemed to flee in disarray, drawing Publius and his force further and further away from the relative safety of the main Roman army. It was a classic tactic of steppe warfare, the feigned flight, an irresistible bait for an overeager commander. And Publius, his blood up, his mind fixed on the singular goal of shattering the enemy, took the bait completely. He spurred his horse on, urging his men to ride faster, convinced that the enemy was breaking, that victory was within his grasp. He saw their backs, and in the calculus of Western warfare, a fleeing enemy was a beaten enemy. He did not see the desert stretching out around him, the vast empty space that was swallowing his small army. He did not see the horizon behind the fleeing Parthians, which remained ominously empty. He did not realize that he was not pursuing a beaten foe, but was being expertly led, like a bull on a rope, into a killing ground perfectly prepared for him. The charge was brave, it was magnificent, it was everything a Roman epic poem would celebrate, and it was utterly, tragically foolish. The exhilaration of the chase was a potent drug. For Putinus and his Gallic horsemen, the sight of the retreating Parthians was a vindication of their aggressive spirit. The thunder of their own hooves replaced the dreadful booming of the kettle drums, and the wind of their passage was a clean, welcome relief from the stagnant, blood-soaked air of the Roman square. They were no longer victims, they were predators. The frustration and helplessness of the past hour melted away, replaced by the primal, triumphant feeling of the hunt. Publius, at the head of the charge, felt the thrill of impending victory. He could see the Parthians clearly now, their backs turned, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. They seemed disorganized, panicked, a rabble in full flight. The distance between Publius's charging force and the main legionary square grew with alarming speed. From the perspective of the men left behind, the magnificent charge began to shrink, becoming a small, dark knot of men and horses receding into the shimmering heat haze. The initial cheer of hope died in their throats, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The desert was vast, and Publius's force, which had seemed so powerful when it burst from their ranks, now looked terrifyingly small and alone. They were a ship, casting off its moorings and sailing into an ocean of unknown size and hostility. Cassius and the other veteran officers watched with a sense of grim foreboding. They recognized the tactic for what it was. This was not a retreat. It was a lure. Publius, however, was blind to the danger. His focus was entirely forward, on the fleeing enemy. He pushed his men harder, believing that one final effort would allow them to crash into the Parthian rear and begin the slaughter. The 8 cohorts of legionaries and the 500 archers who had been sent to support him struggled to keep pace. Their heavy armor and shorter strides no match for the galloping cavalry. They were stretched out in a long vulnerable column, behind the horsemen, their own formation becoming disorganized in the desperate attempt to stay with the charge. The cohesion of the force was breaking down, sacrificed for the sake of speed. Then, the nature of the Parthian retreat changed. The horse archers, who had been fleeing directly away, began to wheel around in a wide, sweeping arc. They were not running anymore, they were maneuvering. At the same time, the dust cloud they were riding towards began to thicken and darken. The ground ahead, which had seemed empty, was suddenly filled. From behind a low, previously unnoticed ridge, a new force emerged, moving not with the fluid grace of the horse archers, but with the slow, inexorable menace of an avalanche. It was the cataphracts. Thousands of them. They had been waiting, hidden, a wall of steel held in reserve. They were a terrifying spectacle, something from a nightmare. Every inch of the rider and his horse was encased in overlapping plates of polished steel or bronze scale mail. Their faces were hidden behind menacing iron masks, giving them an inhuman, demonic appearance. They carried no bows, only a single weapon, the contos, a massive 12-foot-long lance, held steady in both hands. They were the Parthian hammer, the irresistible force designed to shatter anything in their path. The feigned retreat was over. The trap was sprung. The horse archers, their task of luring Publius into position complete, now turned, forming a vast, swirling circle around the Roman force. They began to ride in on themselves, tightening the circle, their movements practiced and precise. Publius and his men suddenly found themselves slowing, their headlong charge grinding to a halt. The enemy was no longer in front of them. The enemy was everywhere. They were encircled, cut off, a tiny island of Roman and Gallic soldiers in a churning, hostile sea of Parthian cavalry. The realization struck Publius with the force of a physical blow. He reined in his horse, his eyes wide with the sudden horrific understanding of his mistake. The desert, which he had seen as an open field for his glorious charge, was in fact a cage, and the door had just slammed shut behind him. He looked back, trying to see the main Roman army, but it was now just a distant shimmer on the horizon, too far to offer any aid. He looked at his men. The fierce, triumphant looks on the faces of his Gauls had been replaced with grim, startled comprehension. The supporting legionaries, breathless and disorganized from their run, were desperately trying to form a defensive line. But it was too late. There was no escape. The desert had swallowed them whole. The silence that fell was the silence of a doomed man who finally sees the executioners. Axe begin its descent? The trap was perfect. The circle of horse archers, a swirling vortex of death, began its work. Just as they had done to the main square, they loosed a storm of arrows into the trapped Roman force. But this time the effect was even more devastating. Publius's men had no large, organized testudo to hide under. The cavalry caught in the open were horribly exposed. Horses screamed and fell, their legs pierced by arrows, throwing their riders to the ground where they were quickly cut down by subsequent volleys. The Gallic horsemen, brave to a fault, attempted desperate, small-scale charges to break the circle, but it was like punching at smoke. The Parthians would simply melt away before them, loosing arrows as they retreated, only to reform their circle. Moments later, the Roman legionaries and archers, now the core of the beleaguered force, formed a small, tight knot of defiance. They created a miniature version of the hollow square, a hedgehog of shields and spears bristling outwards. But they were too few, their formation too small to withstand the sheer volume of fire. The arrows rained down, finding every gap, striking men from all sides. The ground became a tangled mass of dead and dying men and horses, the sand turning dark with blood. The Roman archers tried to return fire, but their bows were weaker than the powerful Parthian composite bows, and their supply of arrows was pitifully small. Their efforts were a futile gesture against the inexhaustible storm. In the center of this maelstrom of pain and chaos stood Publius. The thrill of the charge had evaporated, replaced by the cold, bitter taste of failure. He saw his men, his loyal Gauls who had followed him across the world, being slaughtered around him. He saw the grim-faced legionaries sent to support him, dying because of his own rash ambition. The weight of the catastrophe settled upon him, a burden heavier than any armor. He fought with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, his sword, a blur of motion, cutting down any Parthian who dared to ride too close. But for every one he struck, 100 more remained, their faces impassive, their bows relentless. He was wounded. An arrow had punched through the mail on his thigh, sending a searing jolt of pain up his leg. Another had struck his arm, making it difficult to hold his shield. His horse was hit and collapsed beneath him, and he was thrown to the ground. His loyal retainers rushed to his side, helping him to his feet, forming a small circle of bodies around him, a final living shield to protect their commander. From the ground, surrounded by the dead and dying, Publius could see the battle for what it was, a hopeless one-sided butchery. There was no path to victory. There was no path to escape. There was only death, either a swift one in battle or a shameful one in captivity. For a Roman aristocrat, a man of Publius's standing and pride, the choice was clear. To be captured by these barbarians, to be paraded through their cities as a trophy of war, was a fate worse than any death. It would bring shame upon his family, upon his father, and upon the name of Rome itself. His duty, as he saw it in that final, terrible moment, was to deny the enemy their ultimate prize. His face was a mask of grim resolve. The fire of youthful ambition had been extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard light of Roman stoicism in the face of death. He turned to his shield-bearer, a loyal Celt who had been with him since Gaul, a man whose face was now streaked with tears and grime. Publius's voice was steady, devoid of fear or self-pity. It was the calm, quiet voice of command. "It is over," he said, the words stark and absolute. "I will not be taken alive." The shield-bearer looked at him, his eyes wide with horror and grief, understanding the unspoken order. This was the final service a loyal retainer could perform for his master. Publius knelt, steadying himself. He did not look away. He looked towards the enemy, towards the swirling circle of horsemen, his expression one of pure, unadulterated defiance. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him beg or break. He would die as he had lived, a Roman of the senatorial class, master of his own fate. He offered his side to his shield-bearer, a silent, final command. With a choked sob, the man drew his gladius, the short, practical sword of the legionary, and thrust it into his master's heart. It was an act of mercy, an act of loyalty, an act of profound and tragic honor. In the midst of the slaughter, Publius Crassus chose his own end. His final act a grim testament to the unwritten code that valued honor. Above survival, the death of Publius did not end the fighting, but it broke the last vestiges of the Roman spirit. The small knot of survivors, leaderless and surrounded, fought on with the grim, mechanical courage of men who knew they were already dead. They sold their lives dearly, taking some Parthians with them in the final desperate throes of combat, but the outcome was never in doubt. The swirling circle of horse archers tightened, and the cataphracts who had held back until now, finally, moved in for the kill. Their advance was ponderous, terrifying, a slow-moving wall of iron. They lowered their massive lances, and with a guttural cry, they charged. The impact shattered the last remnants of the Roman formation. The Cantos lances, 12 feet of hardened wood and steel, punched through shields, armor, and men with contemptuous ease. They lifted legionaries from their feet and threw them, impaled onto the men behind them. The charge was not a fluid exchange. It was an act of brutal demolition. What little remained of Publius's command was trampled into the bloody sand under the hooves of the armored war horses. The slaughter was quick, efficient, and absolute. Within minutes, the sounds of fighting died away, replaced by the groans of the dying and the triumphant shouts of the Parthians. The Parthian commander, a nobleman known as Serena, rode through the field of carnage. He was a figure of immense power and presence, his armor more ornate than the others, his gaze sharp and intelligent. He had orchestrated the day's victory with the precision of a master tactician, and now he surveyed his handiwork. He saw the body of Publius, recognizable by his fine armor and the small circle of loyal retainers who had died around him. He dismounted, a sign of respect for a brave, if foolish, enemy commander. He saw the nobility in the young Roman's face, even in death, but Serena was not a sentimental man. He understood the currency of fear and the power of psychological warfare. A dead Roman general was a tragedy for Rome. A dead Roman general's head was a weapon. He gave a sharp command. A Parthian warrior dismounted, drew a heavy blade, and with a few practiced, brutal strokes, severed Publius's head from his body. The head, its handsome features now a grotesque mask of death, its hair matted with blood and sand, was lifted up for Serena to see. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Another soldier brought a spear, and the head was forced down onto its sharpened point, the iron tip emerging gruesomely from the top of the skull. The soldier then took Publius's right hand, a symbol of his pledge and his power, and cut it from his wrist. These were not acts of random savagery. They were calculated messages, symbols to be delivered to the boy's father. The main Roman army, still trapped in its defensive square, had heard the distant sounds of the battle die away. A terrible, hopeful silence had fallen. Some dared to believe that Publius had been victorious, that he had scattered the horse archers and was now pursuing them across the desert. They scanned the horizon desperately, praying to see the triumphant return of their cavalry. Crassus's father's heart, at war with his general's mind, stood frozen with anxiety, his gaze locked on the direction his son had disappeared. The arrow storm against their own position had slackened, the Parthians seemingly content to wait, to let the tension build. Then, they saw movement. A single rider was approaching their lines from the direction of the battle. Not a swirling horse archer, but a lone figure, riding slowly, deliberately. As he drew closer, they saw he was a Parthian of high rank, his armor gleaming. He was not attacking, he was carrying something. A great cheer started to ripple through the Roman ranks, a sound of pure relief. They thought he was an envoy coming to sue for terms, a sign that their cavalry had succeeded. The cheer was born of desperation, a collective need to believe in good news. The rider came to a halt just outside of Pilum range. He said nothing. He simply raised the spear he was carrying. The object impaled on its tip was held high for all to see. The sun caught it, illuminating the pale skin, the dark matted hair, the familiar features now slack in death. The cheer died in an instant, replaced by a sound that was not quite a gasp, not quite a scream, but a terrible, collective exhalation of horror and disbelief. It was the sound of 40,000 hearts breaking at once. The rider, his point made, then the object he carried at his saddle, with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, he threw it onto the sand in front of the Roman lines. It was Publius's severed hand. The message was brutally, sickeningly clear. The charge had not succeeded. The relief force was not coming back. The son of their commander was dead. The Parthian then let out a great, booming laugh, a sound of pure mockery and triumph that echoed across the silent desert. He turned his horse and rode slowly back to his own lines, leaving the head on the spear held high as a silent, gruesome standard, a monument to Roman failure. The head of Publius Crassus, held aloft on the Parthian spear, was more devastating than 1,000 arrows. It was a psychological blow aimed directly at the heart of the Roman army, and it struck with perfect, horrific precision. The sight of it, stark and undeniable against the pale desert sky, acted as a catalyst, transforming the army's simmering fear and anxiety into a state of collective shock. The men stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. This was not just a dead general. It was the son of their supreme commander, a young man many of them had seen, a symbol of the campaign's promise and aristocratic leadership. His death, presented in this barbaric, contemptuous fashion, was a deeply personal violation. A ripple of sound, a low guttural moan, passed through the ranks. It was the sound of hope dying. The desperate belief that Publius's charge had succeeded, that salvation was galloping back towards them, was brutally extinguished. In its place, a cold, terrifying certainty settled in. They were not just trapped, they were doomed. Their best and bravest had been swallowed by the desert and annihilated, and the enemy was now parading the proof of their victory. The discipline that had held the legions together under the arrow storm, the professional stoicism of the Roman soldier, began to shatter like glass. Men looked away from the gruesome spectacle, their eyes finding the ground, unable to bear the sight. Others could not look away, their gaze locked on the head, their faces pale, their mouths agape. The tightly packed ranks, once a source of strength and mutual support, now felt claustrophobic, a pen of doomed men waiting for the slaughter. The psychological armor that every soldier wears, the belief in his own side's strength, in his commander's wisdom, in the possibility of survival, was stripped away in an instant, leaving their nerves raw and exposed. For Marcus Crassus, the blow was absolute. The sight of his son's head, a grotesque parody of the handsome, vibrant face he loved, broke him completely. The ambitious politician, the fabulously wealthy speculator, the would-be conqueror, all vanished in that moment, leaving only a grief-stricken old man. A terrible animal cry of anguish was torn from his throat, a sound so filled with pain that it unnerved the soldiers who heard it even more than the sight of the head itself. His staff officers rushed to his side, but he was inconsolable. He slumped in his saddle, his body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. The mind that had commanded this vast army, the will that had driven it into the heart of this wasteland, had ceased to function. He was no longer a general. He was just a father who had sent his son to a pointless, horrific death. His collapse was visible to the men. They saw their commander, the man whose ambition was the sole reason for their presence in this hell, utterly broken by the consequences of that ambition. The last pillar of authority and confidence was gone. If the commander himself had lost all hope, what hope could there be for the common soldier? A dangerous vacuum of leadership opened up at the very moment it was most needed. The army, already reeling, was now effectively rudderless, adrift in a sea of terror. The Parthians, masters of this cruel theater, allowed the moment to fester. They did not immediately renew their attack. They let the silence and the sight of the head do their work. They renewed the thunder of their kettledrums, the booming, mind-numbing sound now taking on a new, triumphant, and mocking tone. It was a funeral dirge and a victory celebration, all in one. The sound hammered on the shattered nerves of the Romans, a relentless reminder of their helplessness and the enemy's complete control of the situation. The centurions and junior officers, men like Cassius, tried desperately to restore order. They moved through the ranks, their voices harsh, trying to force the men to focus, to dress their lines, to hold their shields steady. Hold the line, stand firm, die like Romans, they yelled, their words a desperate attempt to shore up a collapsing dam. But they were fighting against a tide of despair that was too powerful to hold back. The men's movements were sluggish, their eyes vacant. The cohesive living entity of the legion was disintegrating into a mass of terrified individuals, each trapped in his own private nightmare. The will to fight, the aggressive spirit of the Roman army, had been systematically dismantled and destroyed, first by thirst and exhaustion, then by the arrow storm, and now, finally, by a single, gruesome object on the end of a spear. The battle was not yet over, but the war for the Roman soul was lost. With the Romans' morale shattered and their command structure in disarray, Sirena signaled the resumption of the main attack. The brief, terrible silence was broken once more by the collective twang of thousands of bowstrings, and the sky again turned black with arrows. But this time, the storm fell upon an army that was already spiritually broken. The men reacted not with the disciplined defiance of before, but with the desperate, instinctual terror of trapped animals. The command to form the testudo, the tortoise formation, was given, and the men obeyed, their movements sluggish and clumsy, the great shields locked together over their heads and on their flanks, creating the famed Roman shell, a moving fortress of wood and leather. In past wars, against Gallic swords or Germanic spears, the testudo was a symbol of impenetrable strength, an offensive tool used to advance under fire and breach enemy walls. But here, in the open desert, under the vertical rain of Parthian arrows, it was transformed into something else entirely. It became a prison. Inside the shell, the world was a suffocating, claustrophobic nightmare. The light of the sun was blocked out, replaced by a gloomy twilight, the only illumination coming through the small gaps between the shields. The air quickly became hot and foul, thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and blood. The men were packed, shoulder to shoulder, unable to move, their own comrades pressing in on them from all sides. The only thing to do was to stand, or kneel, and listen to the hell that was unfolding just inches above their heads. The sound was relentless. It was a continuous, deafening roar as volley after volley of heavy armor-piercing arrows hammered down on the shield roof. The noise was a physical assault, a constant jarring vibration that traveled down the men's arms and into their skulls. Each impact was a reminder of the death that was seeking them from above. They could hear the sickening thump and crack as arrows punched through the wood, followed by the choked cries of the men who were hit. A soldier would feel the man next to him shudder and collapse, and there was nothing he could do but hold his own shield steady, praying the next arrow would not find him. The testudo, designed for protection, became a perfect, static target. The Parthian archers, no longer needing to aim at individual men, could simply loose their arrows into the center of the mass, knowing that every shaft would find a mark. The formation that was meant to save the legionaries was now ensuring their destruction, concentrating them into a dense, inescapable killing zone. The arrows that penetrated the roof of shields did not just wound, they created horrific carnage in the packed ranks. An arrow could pass through one man's shoulder and into the neck of the man behind him. The wounded could not be evacuated. They fell where they stood, trampled under the feet of their comrades who were forced to hold the line, their groans and pleas for help adding to the psychological torment. The men in the front ranks, who formed the vertical walls of the test, were no safer. The horse archers would ride closer, lowering their aim, firing directly into the wall of shields at point-blank range. These arrows struck with incredible force, pinning a man's shield to his own body, nailing his arm to his torso. A legionary would be trapped, unable to move, his shield now a permanent, agonizing part of him, until another arrow finished him off. The ground was slick with blood, the dead and wounded piled up, making it difficult to stand, turning the floor of the formation into a treacherous, uneven carpet of bodies. For the men trapped inside this wooden cage, time seemed to warp and stretch. Seconds felt like hours as they waited for the next volley, for the next impact, for the searing pain of the arrow that had their name on it. The bonds of unit cohesion, the trust in the man next to you, began to dissolve under the unbearable strain. It was every man for himself, a solitary struggle for survival in oppressive bodies. The prison of the testudo was not just physical, it was mental. It was the complete loss of agency, the reduction of a proud Roman soldier to a helpless target, waiting for a random, anonymous death to fall from the sky. It was a state of passive suffering, the ultimate antithesis of the Roman military ethos, and it was breaking them in a way no sword or spear ever could. As the afternoon wore on, the sun, which had been their merciless tormentor all day, began its slow descent towards the western horizon. It ceased to be a white-hot disk of punishment and transformed into a great blood-red orb, its light softening, casting long distorted shadows across the battlefield. The change in light brought no relief, only a change in the character of the horror. The landscape, previously bleached of color, was now bathed in a gruesome crimson glow, as if the very air was saturated with the blood that had been spilled. Upon the sand, the Roman army was no longer a recognizable fighting force. It was a wreck. The neat, disciplined square had devolved into ragged, misshapen clumps of survivors, huddled together for a protection that was purely psychological. The ground was littered with the evidence of the day's slaughter. Tens of thousands of spent Parthian arrows stuck out of the earth, so thick in places that they resembled a field of grotesque, black-stemmed weeds. Amidst this grim harvest lay the bodies of the Roman dead, sprawled in the contorted postures of violent death. Their armor, which had glittered so proudly that morning, was now dented, pierced, and stained. Their red cloaks were dark patches of congealed blood on the darkening sand. The arrow storm finally began to slacken. The Parthians, their quivers nearly empty despite the vast resupply, or perhaps simply weary of the killing, began to pull back. They did not retreat in any organized sense, but simply melted away into the twilight, their work for the day done. They left behind a silence that was more profound and terrifying than the noise of battle. It was a silence filled with the sounds of human suffering. From across the battlefield, a low, continuous moan arose. It was the collective voice of thousands of wounded men. Some cried out for their mothers, their voices small and childlike. Others screamed in agony from their untended wounds. Many simply wept, the quiet, hopeless sobs of men who had lost everything. There were calls for water, desperate, croaking pleas that went unanswered. The survivors, themselves exhausted, wounded, and in a state of profound shock, could do little for their comrades. They moved like ghosts among the dead and dying, their faces numb, their eyes vacant. They would stumble over the bodies of men they had shared a joke with that morning, now unrecognizable masses of torn flesh and shattered bone. The scale of the carnage was biblical. Of the more than 40,000 men who had marched into the desert that morning, nearly half were dead or dying. The survivors looked at the faces of the fallen, seeing in them their own fate. They saw friends, bunkmates, men from their own villages. The bonds of the legion, forged over years of shared hardship and training, made the loss deeply personal. Every dead man was a brother. The survivors were not triumphant warriors. They were the shell-shocked remnants of a massacre, wandering through a graveyard of their own making. Crassus, roused from his grief-stricken stupor by his officers, was a broken shell of a man. He did not tour the lines or offer words of comfort. He could not bear to look his men in the eye. He knew that their suffering, the death of his son, the annihilation of his army, was his fault alone. His ambition, his greed, his arrogant refusal to listen to counsel had all led to this. He retreated to his tent, pulling the flaps shut, seeking to hide from the horrific consequences of his leadership. But there was no escape from the sounds of the dying that filled the night air. As darkness finally fell, a profound and chilling cold descended upon the desert. The survivors huddled together for warmth, but it was a cold that seeped into the soul. They did not light large campfires. They were too afraid, too broken. They sat in the dark, listening to the groans of the wounded, each sound a fresh torment. They were surrounded by their dead, miles from safety, with no food, little water, and the certain knowledge that the enemy, who had toyed with them all day, would return with the morning sun. The sun had set on the battle, but it had also set on the pride of Rome, on the lives of 20,000 men, and on the glorious, golden dream of the Parthian campaign. All that was left was the darkness, the cold, and the overwhelming, suffocating presence of death. The night was an eternity of suffering. The cries of the wounded eventually faded into a low, continuous murmur of pain, a sound that became the very texture of the darkness. For the survivors, there was no sleep, only a state of numb, shivering wakefulness. They waited for the dawn with a unique kind of dread, for the light would not bring hope, only the return of their tormentors. The command structure, shattered by the death of Publius and the collapse of Crassus, was slowly pieced back together by the surviving officers. The quaestor, Cassius, and the legate, Octavius. They knew that to remain on the field was suicide. Their only chance, however slim, was to retreat under the cover of darkness. To try and reach the walled Greek city of Carrhae, some 20 miles away. The decision was made, but it came with a horrific moral cost. They could not take the thousands of seriously wounded men with them. To do so would slow them down to a crawl, ensuring the destruction of everyone. A terrible unspoken order was given. The wounded must be left behind. The men who could walk would go. The men who could not would be abandoned to the Parthians or to the desert. It was a decision born of brutal necessity, but it felt like a profound betrayal. The retreat began in silence and shadow. The able-bodied survivors were roused from their stupor and organized into ragged columns. As they began to move out, a new sound of horror arose from the darkness. The wounded, realizing they were being left behind, began to cry out. Those who could move tried to drag themselves after their comrades, their pleas echoing across the dark field. "Don't leave me. For the God's sake, take me with you." Their cries were a fresh torment to the retreating soldiers, a sound of accusation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The men marched with their heads down, their hearts heavy with shame, not daring to look back at the field of groaning shadows they were leaving behind. The retreat was a chaotic, stumbling affair. In the darkness, units became separated. Men, delirious with thirst and fear, wandered off into the desert, never to be seen again. But the bulk of the survivors, led by Cassius and Octavius, managed to reach the relative safety of Carrhae by morning. They barricaded the gates, manned the walls, and for a brief moment, they could breathe. But Carrhae was not a fortress capable of withstanding a siege, and their supplies were limited. It was a temporary reprieve, not a salvation. Surenna and the Parthian army arrived shortly after, their drums once again announcing their presence. They did not assault the city, they simply surrounded it, content to let the Romans trap themselves. Surenna knew that time was on his side. He sent an envoy to the walls, not with threats, but with an offer of a truce. He announced that the great Parthian king, Orodes, was a merciful ruler. He did not wish for further bloodshed. He was prepared to grant the Romans safe passage back to Syria in exchange for a formal treaty. All he required was for the Roman commander Marcus Crassus to meet him in person between the lines to negotiate the terms. The offer was a transparent trap, and the Roman officers knew it. Cassius argued vehemently against it, urging an attempt to break out and flee back to Syria under the cover of night. But the common soldiers, their spirits utterly broken, their only desire to escape this cursed land, seized upon the offer of a truce as their only hope. They were in no condition to fight their way out. The word truce was a magical bomb. They began to clamor for Crassus to accept the offer, their fear overriding all military caution. They surrounded Crassus's quarters, their voices rising in a desperate mutinous chorus, demanding that he go and negotiate. Crassus, who had been in a state of near catatonic grief since the death of his son, was now faced with a new terror, the anger of his own men. He was a broken man, his judgment gone, his will to live extinguished. He looked into the faces of his soldiers, and saw not loyalty, but accusation. He saw the ghosts of the 20,000 dead and the thousands more they had abandoned on the field. He knew the truce was a lie, a final humiliation being prepared for him. He told his officers, "You, and all the gods, are witnesses that I am forced to this. But I go to my death." Dressed in the black robes of mourning rather than a general's cloak, he allowed himself to be led out of the city gates. Accompanied by Octavius and a small retinue of officers, he walked slowly towards the designated meeting point. Serena and his honor guard rode out to meet them, all smiles and courtesy. They brought a horse for Crassus, richly adorned, a supposed gift of honor, but as they helped the old broken Roman onto the horse, the mask of civility dropped. The Parthians suddenly surrounded Crassus and his officers, grabbing at them, trying to disarm them. A scuffle broke out. The Roman officers, realizing the treachery, drew their swords to defend their commander. The fight was brief and one-sided. Octavius and the others were cut down. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the would-be conqueror of the East, was pulled from the horse and taken captive, his final mumbled protest lost in the triumphant shouts of his enemies. The false truce had served its purpose. The head of the snake had been seized. The capture of Crassus sealed the fate of the Roman army. With their commander taken and his senior officers slain in the scuffle, the last vestiges of organized resistance collapsed. The soldiers remaining in Carrhae, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered in droves. A few, led by the pragmatic and ruthless Cassius, had not trusted the truce and had already made their escape, slipping out of the city the night before and beginning a desperate, harrowing flight back to the safety of Roman Syria. But for the vast majority, the war was over. They laid down their arms, their proud eagle standards were seized by the triumphant Parthians, and they were herded into columns, their new lives as slaves about to begin. For Marcus Licinius Crassus, a final, uniquely cruel humiliation was being prepared. He was not treated as an honored captive. He was a prize, a symbol of Rome's arrogance and greed, and his punishment was to be a piece of elaborate, symbolic theater. He was dragged before Serena, not in a command tent, but in the open, before the jeering, triumphant Parthian army. His hands were bound, his fine Roman toga torn and stained with dirt. The man who had owned a significant portion of Rome, who had commanded kings and senators, was now a helpless, pathetic figure. An old man stripped of all dignity. Serena, the architect of the victory, looked down at the captive Roman with a mixture of contempt and theatrical pity. He began a mocking speech, his words translated for the benefit of any captured Romans who could hear. He spoke of Roman avarice, of this unprovoked war of plunder. He pointed to Crassus and declared to his men, "Here is the man who dreamed of Parthian gold. He crossed the desert and sacrificed his son and his army, all for the sake of treasure. He has a great thirst for gold. It is only right that we help him quench it." The Parthian soldiers roared with laughter and approval. A small brazier had been prepared, and on it a crucible filled with gold coins. Some Roman, some Parthian was being heated until it glowed with a malevolent liquid light. The intent was clear, and a fresh wave of terror washed over. This was to be a death of pure, symbolic cruelty, a punishment designed to be told and retold in the marketplaces of the East for generations. A story to warn any other would-be conquerors of the fate that awaited them. Two burly Parthian guards seized Crassus, forcing him to his knees. They wrenched his head back, forcing his jaws apart with the hilt of a dagger. He struggled, a last, futile spasm of resistance, but he was old and weak, and they were strong. He could feel the intense, searing heat of the crucible as it was brought near his face. He could see the shimmering liquid gold, a sight that had once been the source of all his power, now transformed into the instrument of his agonizing death. His eyes, wide with terror, met Serena's for a final moment. He saw no mercy there, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a victor delivering a final poetic justice. Then, the crucible was tilted. The molten gold, a thick, viscous river of fire, was poured directly into his open mouth and down his throat. The pain was unimaginable, beyond description. It was a white-hot, all-consuming agony that obliterated thought, a fire that seared its way through his flesh, boiling his tongue and melting his throat. His body convulsed violently, a horrific, silent dance of death. The guards held him firm, until the last of the liquid metal had been poured, a final gurgling sound escaping his throat before he went limp. The richest man in Rome, the general who had led a war for plunder, was dead, his insides cauterized and filled with the very substance he had craved above all else. The Parthians cheered, their victory now complete and consummated in this act of brutal symbolism. They left his body where it lay, a grotesque testament to the price of greed. The story of his end would travel faster than any army, a chilling message sent back to Rome. It was the ultimate humiliation, not just a defeat in battle, but a mocking, theatrical execution that turned Crassus's defining characteristic, his insatiable lust for wealth, into the very instrument of his demise. The campaign built on avarice had ended with its architect being consumed by a literal, fiery representation of his own fatal flaw. With Crassus dead and the last pockets of resistance extinguished, the true spoils of the Parthian victory were gathered. It was not just the gold from the Roman camp or the fine armor of the officers. The most valuable prize was the men themselves. 10,000 Roman legionaries, the survivors of the slaughter, were now prisoners of war. These were not mere conscripts. They were highly trained, disciplined, professional soldiers, the product of the most effective military system in the world. To the Parthians, they were a valuable resource. Their new life began with the systematic stripping away of their old one. The first to go were the symbols of their Roman identity. Their armor, the larica segmentata that was the hallmark of the legionary, was taken from them. Their helmets, their shields, their gladius swords, all the tools of their trade and symbols of their status were confiscated. They were left in their simple tunics, now tattered and stained, reduced to the level of common laborers. The change was profoundly disorienting. For his entire adult life, the legionary had been defined by his gear. It was his second skin, the source of his pride and his power. Without it, he felt naked, vulnerable, and anonymous. Next came the eagle standards. The golden aquilia of the defeated legions, the very souls of their units, were taken down from their poles. For the Parthians, they were magnificent trophies, symbols of a victory over the world's greatest power. For the captured Romans, watching their sacred eagles being carried away by their enemies was the ultimate shame, a spiritual death that was in some ways worse than a physical one. It was a visual confirmation of their absolute defeat. Their legions, as fighting units, had ceased to exist. Their honor was lost. They were then bound, not with the respect due to defeated soldiers, but with the rough ropes of slaves. Their hands, which had expertly wielded the pilum and the gladius, were tied behind their backs. They were organized into long shuffling columns, the familiar formations of the cohort and maniple now replaced by the chaotic lines of a slave coffle. The centurions, who had once been figures of absolute authority, were now just prisoners. Among the rest, their helmet crests gone, their vine staffs broken. The hierarchy that had been the bedrock of their world had been dissolved. They were all equal now in their misery. The process was one of deliberate dehumanization. The Parthian guards treated them not as men, but as cattle. They were prodded with spears, shouted at in a language they could not understand, and given meager rations of coarse bread and foul water. Any sign of defiance was met with a swift, brutal beating. The Romans, who had marched into this land, as conquerors confident in their inherent superiority, were now forced to learn the harsh, humiliating language of submission. They learned to keep their eyes down, to obey instantly, to suppress the pride that had been ingrained in them since birth. As they were prepared for the long march east, away from the familiar world of the Mediterranean and into the unknown heart of Asia, a profound sense of dislocation set in. They were not just prisoners. They were becoming ghosts. Their names, their families, their homes in Italy, or Spain, or Gaul seemed to belong to another life. A world that was receding with every step they took away from Roman territory. They were being erased. Their identity as Roman citizens, as legionaries of the Republic, was being systematically dismantled and discarded. They were becoming simply captivict as a word that would now define their entire existence. They were no longer part of the grand glorious story of Rome. They had fallen off the map, their individual stories swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the Parthian Empire. The journey east was a new kind of hell, a slow, grinding ordeal that replaced the acute terror of battle with the chronic misery of a death march. The 10,000 captured Romans were herded like livestock, their destination a mystery, their future a terrifying blank. The landscape they traversed was a panorama of alien desolation, a world utterly removed from the green hills and familiar coastlines of home. They crossed vast salt-crusted deserts where the horizon shimmered with heat and mirages, and the sun beat down with a relentless punishing force. The thirst that had plagued them before the battle returned as a constant companion, a dry, rasping torment in their throats. Their path then led them upwards, into the jagged, forbidding mountain ranges of the Iranian plateau. Here, the searing heat of the desert gave way to a biting, high-altitude cold. Their simple tunics, adequate for the Syrian plains, offered little protection against the freezing winds that howled through the rocky passes. They climbed narrow, treacherous trails, their feet, clad in worn-out sandals or wrapped in rags, cut and bruised by the sharp stones. The air grew thin, making every breath a conscious effort. Every step a monumental struggle for men already weakened by malnutrition and despair. The march was a relentless process of attrition. Men succumbed to exhaustion, their bodies simply giving out, and they would collapse by the side of the trail. The Parthian guards, showing no mercy, would either leave them where they fell to be picked apart by vultures, or end their suffering with a swift, indifferent spear thrust. Others fell sick, their bodies racked with dysentery from foul water or fever from infected wounds. There were no medics, no comfort, only the grim certainty that to fall behind was to die. Each day, the column of prisoners grew a little shorter, their numbers thinned not by a single glorious battle, but by the slow, anonymous attrition of the march. For the survivors, the psychological toll was as great as the physical one. The world they knew had vanished. The gods they had prayed to seemed to have abandoned them. The language, the customs, the very stars in the night sky were different. They were adrift in a sea of foreignness, a feeling of profound and terrifying isolation. They were marching deeper and deeper into a void, a place from which they knew there would be no return. The hope of rescue, of a Roman army coming to liberate them, faded with every eastward step, eventually extinguishing itself completely. Rome, the center of their universe, was now an impossible, dreamlike memory. They clung to what little they had left, each other. The bonds of the legion, though stripped of their formal structure, endured in the small acts of camaraderie that kept them alive. A stronger man would help a weaker one over a difficult pass. A soldier would share his meager ration of bread with a comrade who was flagging. They would speak to each other in low, quiet Latin, the familiar sounds of their native tongue, a small island of comfort in a world of alien speech. They would recall stories of home, of festivals in their villages, of the faces of their wives and children, whispering these memories to each other in the cold nights like a sacred litany, a desperate attempt to keep their past selves alive. The Parthian guards watched them with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. These were the legendary soldiers who had conquered the world, now reduced to this pathetic, shuffling column of misery. Yet even in their wretched state, there was something about the Romans that was different. A flicker of their old discipline remained. They did not descend into a complete rabble. They maintained a semblance of order, a quiet, grim dignity that was baffling to their captors. It was the ghost of the legion, the last faint echo of the machine that had once been, and it was this stubborn, ingrained discipline that allowed many of them to survive a journey that should have killed them. All after months of marching, after crossing a continent of hostile terrain, the survivors, their journey ended in a place that felt like the end of the world. The city of Margiana, later known as Merv, rose from the dusty plains of the Carrhae desert like a mirage. It was a sprawling oasis city, a vital hub on the Great Silk Road. But to the Roman prisoners, it was a purgatory. This was not a city in the Roman sense, with ordered grid patterns, forums, and marble temples. It was a labyrinth of mud-brick walls, bustling, chaotic bazaars filled with the smells of exotic spices and strange foods, and a cacophony of languages: Parthian, Greek, Sogdian, Bactrian, none of them their own. The faces in the crowds were alien, weathered by different suns, their features a tapestry of Central Asian peoples the Romans had never known existed. Here, in this remote frontier province, the surviving legionaries were given their new purpose. They were too valuable as soldiers to be wasted on manual labor in the fields or quarries. The Parthian Empire, like Rome, had its own barbarian problems. The northeastern frontier was under constant threat from nomadic tribes, fierce horsemen, from the steppes known to the Parthians as the Saka, and to the Chinese, further east, as the Zhang. These were relentless savage warriors who raided and plundered the rich oasis cities of the empire. The Parthians needed skilled, disciplined soldiers to man the bleak, isolated forts that guarded this vulnerable border. And in the 10,000 captured Romans, they had found a ready-made garrison. The legionaries were rearmed, but not with their own familiar gear. Their Roman swords and shields were gone forever. Instead, they were issued Parthian-style equipment: smaller, round shields, scale armor, and short spears. They were being remade in the image of their captors. Their new role was a bitter irony. The soldiers of the world's greatest conquering army were now to serve as border guards, defending the empire of their enemies from other barbarians. They were no longer legionaries of the Republic. They were mercenaries in the service of the Parthian king, their lives forfeit for an empire that was not their own. They were stationed in the forts and watchtowers that dotted the vast, empty landscape along the Oxus River. Life here was monotonous and grim. The days were marked by the relentless sun and the howling wind. The nights by a profound star-filled silence that was utterly alien. Their duties were drilling, standing guard, and patrolling the endless dusty plains. They were watched constantly by their Parthian commanders, their loyalty always in question. But the Romans, with their ingrained professionalism, performed their duties with a grim efficiency. Discipline was all they had left. It was the one part of their Roman identity they could cling to in this foreign land. They would practice their old formations, the familiar movements, a comfort, a connection to their past. The centurions, though stripped of their official rank, still commanded the respect of their men. They maintained the routines of the legion, organizing the watches, overseeing the drills, and settling disputes. They created a small, self-contained, Roman world in the heart of Central Asia, a bubble of familiar order in a universe of chaos. They were men without a home, without a future, but they still had their discipline. Yet with every passing year, their Roman identity began to fray. At the edges, they were a community of men, with no Roman women, no new citizens to replenish their ranks. Some began to take local wives, Bactrian or Sogdian women, and their children grew up speaking a mixture of Latin and local dialects. Their loyalties, divided, the men's Latin became colored with Parthian words. They adopted local customs, ate local foods, and learned to navigate the complex politics of a frontier outpost. The sharp, clear lines of their Roman identity began to blur. The memory of Italy, of the Senate and the people of Rome, grew fainter. Like a story told so many times, it begins to lose its meaning. They were becoming something new, something hybrid, men shaped by the discipline of Rome, but forged in the crucible of the East. They were no longer just Romans. They were the garrison of Margiana, the king's foreign guard. Their past a fading dream, their present a monotonous reality of dust, wind, and waiting. Asterisk, of course. Here's the 20th section of the script. Section 20, Men without a hometime. In the desolate frontier of Margiana became a slow, featureless river. The sharp, painful memories of Carrhae and the death march began to soften, their edges worn smooth by the relentless succession of days. The seasons turned, the searing heat of summer giving way to the bitter cold of winter, and back again. A year passed, then 5, then 10. A decade is a lifetime for a soldier. Babies born on the day of the battle were now children. The world the legionaries had left behind had moved on without them. News from the west was scarce and unreliable, filtered through the mouths of Silk Road merchants and travelers. They heard fragmented, distorted tales of the Roman Civil War, of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, of the death of Pompey. The Republic they had served, with its delicate balance of power and political rivalries, was gone, replaced by a new order they could not comprehend. The world they had fought for no longer existed. The legionaries were now men in their 30s and 40s. The youthful vigor that had carried them into Syria was gone, replaced by the hardened, weary resilience of long-term survivors. Their faces were weathered, tanned by the harsh Central Asian sun, and etched with the lines of hardship and loss. Their bodies were scarred, not just from the battle, but from the countless small skirmishes and patrols on the frontier. They were still Romans, but they were a different kind of Roman now, one that would have been unrecognizable in the Forum. Their lives were a strange fusion of two worlds. In the barracks, they maintained the semblance of a Roman cohort. They spoke their rough camp Latin, shared old jokes, and sang the marching songs of their youth, though the lyrics now sounded hollow and strange in this foreign land. They would scratch Roman graffiti onto the mud brick walls of their forts' names, crude drawings, curses against the Parthians, a small, defiant act of preserving their identity. They clung to the memory of their gods, offering quiet prayers to Jupiter and Mars, though the faces of the statues in the temples of their hometowns were growing harder to recall. But outside the barracks, they were part of a different world. Their children, born to local women, were a living bridge between two cultures. These children played games with Latin names but chattered in Syrian. They had their father's Roman nose but their mother's Bactrian eyes. They knew the stories of Romulus and Remus, but also the myths of Zoroaster for the lead. Looking at their own children was a daily reminder of how far they had come, and of the impossibility of ever going back. These children belonged to the East. They had no connection to the distant, half-forgotten land of Italy. The men's relationship with their Parthian masters evolved from one of pure hostility to a complex, pragmatic coexistence. They were still prisoners, their freedom forfeit, but their value as elite soldiers afforded them a degree of respect and autonomy that other slaves would never know. They developed a grudging respect for the Parthian commanders who fought alongside them against the steppe nomads. They were all soldiers on the same dangerous frontier, facing the same savage enemies. A bond, forged in shared danger, began to form between captor and captive. Yet, a profound and unshakable melancholy settled over the legionaries. They were men without a country, without a people. They were ghosts, living in a liminal space between a past they could not reclaim and a future they did not choose. In the quiet moments, standing watch on a lonely tower, overlooking the vast empty steppe, a legionary would be struck by a sudden, overwhelming wave of homesickness. The smell of a certain spice in the market might trigger a powerful, painful memory of a meal cooked by his mother. The sight of a particular cloud formation might remind him of the skies over his family's farm in Campania. These moments were a form of torture, a sharp stabbing reminder of the world they had lost. They were men suspended between two lives, truly belonging to neither. They were no longer just the vanquished of Carrhae. They were the lost, the forgotten, men whose only true home was the memory of a world that had ceased to exist. Asterisk. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the disaster at Carrhae. The Roman survivors were now middle-aged men, their youth a distant country. The world had been reshaped around them. The Roman Republic was a memory, replaced by the iron will of Augustus Caesar, the first true emperor. In Parthia, the Arceus dynasty continued its complex dance of power, wealth, and intrigue. And far to the east, beyond the towering Pamir Mountains, the great Han Dynasty of China was expanding its influence, pushing its borders westward along the lucrative Silk Road. The world was shrinking, and the remote frontier where the lost legionaries served was about to become a point of collision between great powers. The source of the new conflict was a familiar one, the relentless pressure of the nomadic tribes of the steppes. The Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of horse nomads who had long been a thorn in the side of the Han Chinese, were fracturing. One of their leaders, a chieftain named Zhizhi Chanyu, had been defeated in a power struggle and had fled westward with his followers. He was a man of immense ambition and brutality, and he carved out a new kingdom for himself in the lands bordering the Parthian and Han spheres of influence. He established a capital, a fortified city on the Talos River, and from this new base, he began to raid and terrorize his neighbors, disrupting the flow of trade and challenging the established powers. His aggression soon brought him into direct conflict with the Parthians. Cheesy's raids grew bolder, striking at the oasis cities and caravan routes that were the lifeblood of the Parthian northeastern frontier. For the Parthian king, this new aggressive power on his border was an intolerable threat. He could not allow a rogue state to destabilize the region and choke off the wealth flowing from the east. The decision was made to send an army to support his local allies and confront this new menace. For the Roman legionaries garrisoned in Margiana, this news arrived not as a distant political concern, but as a direct order. Their long, monotonous years of border patrol were over. They were being mobilized for a major campaign. Their skill in siege warfare and disciplined infantry tactics, honed over generations of Roman conquest, was now a critical asset for their Parthian masters. The Parthians were masters of cavalry warfare, but they often struggled against fortified positions. The Romans were specialists in breaking down walls. A strange sense of purpose, long dormant, stirred within the aging legion. For 20 years, they had been guards, watchmen, a static defense force. Now, they were being called to march to war again. It was a grim prospect, but it was also a return to the life they had been trained for. The old instincts, buried under years of routine and despair, began to resurface. They cleaned their armor, sharpened their spears, and prepared their gear with the practiced efficiency of veterans. As they assembled for the march, they were a strange and unique sight. They were no longer a pure Roman force. Their ranks were filled out with younger men, the sons they had fathered in this new land, who fought alongside their fathers. Their equipment was a hybrid of Roman and Parthian styles. They marched not under the golden eagle of the Republic, but under the dragon standards of a Parthian general. They were a legion of ghosts, a living relic of a lost army, now being sent into a new war, a conflict between powers their ancestors had never even known existed. They marched east, away from the relative familiarity of their long exile, and into a new, unknown territory. They were heading towards a confrontation with the Xiongnu, a people they knew only as savage raiders. But beyond the Xiongnu, unseen and unknown, lay another power, the Han Chinese, who also viewed Zizi as a threat that had to be eliminated. The lost legionaries, men who had fallen off the map of the Western world, were marching unwittingly towards a collision point, a place where the far-reaching ambitions of Rome's great, unknown rival in the East were about to intersect with their own tragic and unbelievable story. Asterisk, of course. Here is the 22nd section of the script, section 22. An asset to their masters, the march eastward was a journey into an even more alien world. The landscape changed from the arid plains of Margiana to the rugged, windswept steppes of what is now Kazakhstan. This was the homeland of the nomadic horsemen, a vast, rolling sea of grass that stretched to an endless horizon. For the Roman legionaries, accustomed to the defined landscapes of Italy or the contained chaos of a city, the sheer, featureless immensity of the steppe was disorienting. It was a land without landmarks, a place where a man could lose his way and vanish without a trace. They marched as part of a larger Parthian army, a colorful and chaotic host that was a stark contrast to the disciplined order of a Roman legion. The core of the Parthian force was, as always, its cavalry, the magnificently armored cataphracts and the swirling, untouchable horse archers. The Romans, with their hybrid gear and steady marching pace, were an anomaly in this fluid, horse-based army. They were the anchor, the solid, dependable infantry contingent that their Parthian commanders now relied upon for the dirty close quarters work of siegecraft and holding a line. Their value to their masters had never been more apparent. As the combined army moved into the territory controlled by Zizi Chainu, they encountered numerous small fortified settlements. These were the strongholds of Zizi's followers, rough and ready forts designed to withstand the lightning raids of other nomadic tribes. For the Parthian cavalry, these forts were frustrating obstacles. They could surround them, cut them off, but they lacked the specialized skills and equipment to assault them directly. This was where the Romans excelled. The old instincts, the muscle memory of 1,000 training drills, took over. The aging centurions, their hair now gray but their eyes still sharp, directed the work with their old authority. They organized the men into construction details, and the sounds of Roman engineering, long absent from their lives, once again filled the air. They built siege ramps, great earthen inclines that allowed attackers to reach the top of the walls. They constructed battering rams, their heavy, rhythmic thudding, a sound that struck fear into the hearts of the defenders. They even assembled a version of the testudo, the tortoise formation, using their Parthian issue shields to advance under the enemy's arrows and reach the base of the walls. Their Parthian commanders watched with a mixture of awe and appreciation. They saw the Romans' methodical, relentless approach to war, so different from their own focus on speed and maneuver. They saw how the Romans worked together as a seamless unit, each man knowing his task. Their discipline, holding firm even under fire, In these moments the Romans were not just slaves or mercenaries, they were masters of a deadly craft, and their skill was an invaluable asset. For the legionaries themselves, the work was a strange and bitter homecoming. They were practicing the very arts of war that had made Rome the master of the world, but they were doing so in the service of a foreign king to expand an empire that was not their own. Every expertly constructed siege engine, every successful assault on a barbarian fort, was a testament to the skills they had learned as young men. In the service of the Republic, it was a source of pride, but it was a pride tinged with a deep and abiding sorrow. They were ghosts of a Roman legion, performing their deadly dance for a new audience, their glory belonging to their captors. As they pushed deeper into Gizi's territory, their reputation preceded them. The nomadic defenders, accustomed to fighting Parthian cavalry in the open field, were terrified by this strange foreign infantry that fought with such relentless, systematic efficiency. The Romans became the spearhead of the Parthian advance, the key that unlocked the gates of Gizi's kingdom. They were no longer just the forgotten garrison of Margiana. They were once again what they had always been: elite, professional soldiers, an instrument of conquest. But the conquest was not for Rome. It was a hollow victory, a display of their lost greatness. Played out on a remote and forgotten stage at the far end of the world, the campaign culminated at the capital of the Rogue King, a fortified city on the banks of the Talas River, known to the Chinese who were also marching against it as the city of Gizi. When the Parthian-led army arrived, they found a formidable defensive position. The city was protected by a deep moat and, more surprisingly, a double wall. The outer wall was a palisade of heavy wooden stakes, a common feature of nomadic fortifications, but behind it stood something unexpected, a more substantial inner wall, constructed with a technique and a level of engineering that was unusual for the region. The Allied force, with the Romans as their siege experts, began the assault. The battle that unfolded was a brutal, chaotic affair, a clash of different worlds and different ways of war. The Jiangnu defenders, led by the fierce Gizi Chunyu himself, fought with a savage desperation. They rained arrows down from the walls and launched ferocious counterattacks, their warriors screaming battle cries that were alien to both Parthian and Roman ears. It was during this chaotic siege that the lost legionaries came face to face with the other great power that had come to destroy Gizi. On the other side of the city, another army had arrived, the army of the Han Dynasty, led by the brilliant and ruthless general Chen Tang. The Chinese force had marched across the forbidding Pamir Mountains on their own punitive expedition. The two armies, allies of convenience against a common enemy, now found themselves fighting in close proximity, observing each other with a mixture of caution and intense curiosity. For the Roman soldiers, the sight of the Han army was a profound shock. They had spent their lives believing that Rome and its eastern neighbor, Parthia, were the two great poles of the civilized world. The existence of a third, equally powerful and sophisticated empire in the far, far east was a concept that was difficult to comprehend. They watched the Chinese soldiers, their armor of lacquered leather, their powerful crossbows, and their disciplined formations, with a sense of wonder. It was like discovering a new continent, a new humanity. The climax of the siege came as the attackers, having breached the outer wooden palisade, prepared to assault the main inner wall. It was here that the Romans deployed their most unique and recognizable tactic. Under a hail of arrows from the city walls, a contingent of the legionaries formed up, their shields held aloft and interlocked. They advanced towards the wall in a tight, impenetrable block. The shields on the top sloped like a roof, the shields on the front and sides forming vertical walls. From the perspective of the Han Chinese soldiers watching from their own section of the siege line, it was a bizarre and unprecedented sight. They had never seen such a formation. In the official Han histories, compiled years later by the historian Ban Gu, the tactic was described with meticulous curiosity. He wrote of seeing soldiers in the enemy camp who advanced with their shields linked in a fish-scale formation. It was a perfect, if poetic, description of the Roman testudo. The interlocking, overlapping shields, glistening in the sun, did indeed resemble the scales of a great armored fish. The Chinese commanders, including Chen Tang, took careful note of these strange foreign warriors who fought with such peculiar and effective discipline for their Jiangnu-Parthian foes. They were a puzzle, an anomaly on a battlefield at the edge of the known world. The lost legionaries, in a desperate attempt to survive, had inadvertently announced their presence to the other great empire of antiquity. ***, the order, spoken in the rough, hybrid Latin of the exiles, cut through the din of Beto, testugini formate. The command was instinct, a ghost from a past life, but the men responded with the ingrained precision of their youth. 100 or more of the legionaries, the fittest and most experienced among them, moved together as one. They were no longer a ragged band of mercenaries. In this moment, they were a Roman cohort again. They raised their shields, no longer the iconic curved scuda of the Republic, but the smaller, rounder shields issued by their Parthian masters. It was a clumsy, imperfect fit, but the principle was the same. The men in the front rank formed a solid wall, their shields held edge to edge. The ranks behind them raised their shields over their heads, overlapping them with the precision of master roofers laying tiles. The men on the flanks turned their shields outwards, completing the armored box. Within seconds, a chaotic group of individual soldiers had transformed into a single, cohesive, armored creature. To the Han Chinese soldiers observing from their positions, it was a piece of military theater unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Their own warfare was based on massed infantry, powerful crossbows, and disciplined cavalry charges, all directed by a rigid command structure signaled by flags and drums. They understood formations, but this was something else entirely. It was organic, reptilian. The fish-scale description that would later enter their histories was born in this moment of stunned observation. They saw how the overlapping shields, whether bronze or iron, caught the light, shimmering like the scales of a great carp. They saw how the formation moved, not with the rigid geometry of a Chinese infantry block, but with a slow, crawling, inexorable advance. Like some great beast emerging from the water, the formation began to move forward. A slow, shuffling advance across the broken ground between the two walls. The Jianyu defenders on the inner wall, who had never seen such a thing, redoubled their fire. A storm of arrows descended on the strange formation. The Chinese observers watched, expecting the structure to break, for men to fall. But it held. The arrows clattered and skittered off the shield roof, their energy dissipated by the angled, overlapping surfaces. A few found their mark, punching through a gap or a weaker shield, and a man would fall inside the formation, his body quickly pulled out of the way by his comrades as the creature continued its advance. The fish-scale formation was a moving sanctuary of discipline in the heart of chaos. Inside the box, it was dark, hot, and deafening. The men moved blindly, trusting the man in front of them, their steps guided by the rhythmic shouts of the centurion who marched within their ranks. The roar of the battle was muffled, replaced by the continuous, deafening drumming of arrows and stones striking the shields just inches above their heads. It was the prison of the testudo all over again, but this time it was not a symbol of helpless defense, but a tool of aggressive, relentless assault. The Chinese general, Chen Tang, watched the spectacle with a keen, analytical eye. He was a brilliant, pragmatic commander, and he instantly recognized the tactical genius of what he was seeing. He saw a solution to a problem that had plagued infantry for centuries: how to advance on a fortified position without being decimated by missile fire. He noted the discipline required, the way each man had to subordinate his own survival to the integrity of the whole. He saw the strange foreign soldiers who employed this tactic, noting their disciplined movements, their steady advance, and their utter professionalism, even in the service of a barbarian chieftain. These were not wild-steppe nomads. These were soldiers of a different caliber, a different tradition. Their presence on this battlefield was a mystery, and Chen Tang was a man who did not like mysteries. He filed the image away in his mind, the strange, scaled beast, crawling towards the wall, a living testament to a way of war he had never known existed. General Chen Tang was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a product of the Han Dynasty's meritocratic, yet ruthless, military and bureaucratic system. He was educated, literate, and a keen observer of men and tactics. His career was built on pragmatism, ambition, and a willingness to take calculated risks, a quality that had led him to launch this unauthorized long-range expedition against Jitsi Chanyu in the first place. As he stood on the command platform overlooking the siege, his gaze was fixed on the peculiar drama unfolding on the Parthian allied front. His attention was not on the main chaotic swirl of the battle, but on the small, disciplined contingent of foreign soldiers in their bizarre fish-scale formation. While his own officers might have dismissed them as a mere curiosity, Chen Tang saw something more. He saw a military tradition, a doctrine of war that was utterly alien to the Chinese experience, yet undeniably effective. He summoned a scribe, a man whose job was to keep the official campaign log, the detailed record that would be submitted to the emperor upon their return to the capital Chang'an. Note the auxiliaries fighting for the Xiongnu. Chen Tang began, his voice calm and precise, cutting through the noise of the battle. He did not yet know they were allied with the Parthians. From his perspective, anyone fighting alongside Jizi's men was part of the same enemy force. Describe their formation. A double line of wooden stakes defends their gate. He was referring to the defensive structures the Romans had likely helped engineer for Jitsi, a detail that stood out to his professional eye. He continued, his gaze still locked on the testudo as it crawled towards the wall. The infantry are deployed in a formation with shields linked, resembling the scales of a fish. He chose his words carefully, striving for an accurate, objective description. He was not just a general, he was an intelligence gatherer, and this was valuable data. The Han Empire was always seeking to understand the barbarians on its borders, to learn their strengths and weaknesses. These strange soldiers were a new and significant variable. The scribe's brush flew across the bamboo slips, the elegant Chinese characters capturing the general's observations. Chen Tang noted their discipline under fire, the way they held their formation, even as arrows rained down upon them. He noted their methodical advance, a stark contrast to the wild, screaming charges of the Xiongnu warriors. He saw in them a reflection of his own army's most prized quality, discipline, but it was a different flavor of discipline, one seemingly born of a different philosophy of war. He also noted their appearance. Even from a distance they looked different from the Parthians and the Xiongnu. They were taller, their features sharper, their bearing distinct. They fought with a grim, silent professionalism that was deeply impressive. Who were these men? Where did they come from? How did a contingent of such elite, foreign soldiers end up here, at the far western fringe of the world, fighting for a nomadic chieftain? These were the questions that occupied Chen Tang's mind even as he directed his own troops in the final assault. The presence of these mysterious warriors was a piece of a larger geopolitical puzzle that he was only just beginning to see. The world to the west of the Pamir Mountains, the lands of the Parthians and beyond, was not just a chaotic sea of barbarian tribes. It clearly contained organized, disciplined powers with sophisticated military traditions. These fish soldiers were the first tangible evidence of that fact he had ever seen. His notes were not merely a curious aside in a battle report, they were a strategic assessment. They were a warning and an observation for the Han court. The world was larger and more complex than they had imagined. New powers, new threats, and new potential rivals existed beyond the horizon. The lost legionaries in their desperate fight for survival had unknowingly become ambassadors of a sort, their strange tactics serving as the first faint diplomatic signal between the two great empires of the ancient world. Chen Tang, the astute Han commander, was the first to receive that signal, and he made sure it was recorded for posterity. The siege of Jizi's capital reached its brutal climax. While the fish-scale formation of the Romans was a tactical marvel, it was ultimately a small part of a much larger battle, and the tide was turning decisively in favor of the Han Chinese. Chen Tang was a superior strategist, and his army was a formidable instrument of war. His engineers erected massive siege towers, and his crossbowmen, firing from elevated platforms, unleashed a devastating barrage of bolts that swept the city, walls clean of defenders. The final assault was a massive, coordinated attack from all sides. Han soldiers, their red banners held high, swarmed across the moat and surged up scaling ladders, their war cries drowning out all other sounds. They were relentless, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. The Xiongnu warriors, for all their ferocity, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and superior organization of the Han army. The Parthian contingent, including the Roman survivors, found themselves caught in a collapsing pocket, their own attacks stalling as the main defensive effort shifted to counter the more dangerous Han assault. The battle for the city devolved into a bloody street-by-street fight. Gitzi Chanyu himself, wounded in the face by a crossbow bolt, was cornered and killed in his citadel. With the death of their leader, the last of the Xiongnu resistance crumbled. The victory belonged to the Han. It was total and absolute. The Roman legionaries. The moment was one of profound and bitter irony. They had survived the catastrophic defeat at Carrhae, endured 2 decades of exile, and fought their way across a continent, only to end up on the losing side of a battle between two powers they had never known existed. As the Han soldiers swarmed into their section of the battlefield, they were faced with a stark choice: fight to the death against this new, unknown enemy, or surrender. Exhausted, outnumbered, and with their Parthian and Xiongnu allies either dead or fleeing, there was no real choice. The ingrained discipline that had served them so well now dictated a different course of action. A hopeless fight was not courage, it was suicide. The senior surviving centurion, a man whose entire life had been a litany of survival against impossible odds, gave the final bitter order of his career. He commanded his men to lay down their arms. They dropped their spears and shields onto the bloody ground, the clatter of their surrender lost in the roar of the Han victory. They stood grim-faced and silent as the Chinese soldiers surrounded them. It was the second time in their lives they had been captured. The first time, at Carrhae, they had been the proud soldiers of a great republic, and their capture had been a shocking, world-altering catastrophe. This time, they were nameless mercenaries, a strange footnote in someone else's war, and their surrender felt less like a tragedy and more like the final, inevitable turn of a cruel fate. The Han soldiers stared at their strange captives with immense curiosity. They disarmed them, noting the unfamiliar designs of their hybrid armor and the foreign features of their faces. They were herded together, separated from the other prisoners, their unique appearance and the memory of their fish-scale formation marking them as something special, something to be brought to the attention of the commanding general. They were once again prisoners, their fate now in the hands of a new master, an emperor whose name they did not know, in a land that lay even further beyond the edge of their world. Their long, strange journey was not over. It was simply entering its final, most unbelievable chapter. ***. The captured legionaries were brought before General Chen Tang. He surveyed the strange foreign warriors with a cool, appraising gaze. He saw not the arrogance of the Xiongnu, or the exoticism of the Parthians, but something else, a quiet, disciplined dignity, even in defeat. He saw the hard, weathered faces of professional soldiers, Through interpreters, he questioned them. The story that emerged, fragmented and pieced together from their broken Parthian and the interpreters' limited knowledge, was astonishing. Spoke of a great empire in the far west called Liqian, the name the Han Chinese used for the Roman Empire. They spoke of a disastrous battle decades ago, of their capture, and of their long exile. Chen Tang, a man of bold and independent thought, was faced with a decision. By the normal rules of war, these men were enemy combatants, mercenaries in the service of a foe of the Han Empire. The standard procedure would be execution or enslavement in the mines. But Chen Tang saw not just prisoners, he saw an opportunity. These men possessed unique military skills, particularly in engineering and disciplined infantry tactics. Skills that could be valuable to the Han. To kill them would be a waste. To enslave them would be to squander their potential. Presenting such unique and exotic captives to the emperor in Chang'an would be a magnificent political coup. It would add to the glory of his victory and demonstrate the vast reach of Han power, which could now claim prisoners from an almost mythical empire in the west. It was a far more impressive trophy than the head of a mere barbarian chieftain. Upon his triumphant, if unsanctioned, return to the Han capital, Chen Tang presented his case and his captives at the imperial court. The legionaries, now numbering just over 140 men, were marched before the dragon throne of the Han Emperor, Yuan of Han. For the Romans, it was a bewildering, awe-inspiring spectacle. They were led into a vast, ornate throne room filled with silk-clad courtiers, lacquered pillars, and the scent of incense. It was a display of wealth and power that rivaled anything they had ever imagined, a world away from the dusty, pragmatic world of the Roman Senate. The emperor, a remote and godlike figure seated on the throne, listened to Chen Tang's report. He looked down at the strange fair-haired and round-eyed men standing before him. He was intrigued by the story of their origins, and impressed by the general's description of their fish-scale formation and their discipline. Like Chen Tang, the emperor saw their potential value. The Han Empire, much like the Roman, had its own troublesome frontiers, particularly in the northwest, where the threat of nomadic raids was constant. A debate ensued among the court advisors. Some argued for their execution as a warning to any other foreigners who might fight against the Han, but Chen Tang's pragmatic view, backed by the sheer novelty of the situation, won the day. The emperor, in his wisdom, made a proclamation. These men were not to be executed, they were not to be enslaved. Their skill as soldiers was to be respected and utilized. He made them an offer. They would be granted their freedom and their lives. In return, they would pledge their loyalty to him, the Han Emperor, and serve as soldiers of the empire. They would be given land, homes, and wives. They would be settled on the far northwestern frontier, in the Gansu Corridor, a region that bordered the hostile lands of the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert. There, they would serve as a special garrison, their task to defend the empire's border and to train local troops in their unique methods of warfare. For the legionaries who had expected nothing but death, the offer was a miracle. It was a chance not just to live, but to have a life again, to have a home, to build something new from the ashes of their old world. It was an offer they could not refuse. Their final journey was not a march in chains, but a state-sponsored relocation. Under the escort of Han officials, the last survivors of Crassus's army traveled eastward, deeper into the heart of China, a land of sprawling, fertile plains, great rivers, and cities that dwarfed anything they had ever known. They eventually reached their destination, a remote, wind-swept patch of territory in the Gansu province, a vital corridor connecting the Chinese heartland to the deserts of the west. It was a frontier, a place where the settled agricultural world of China met the vast, untamed wilderness. Here, on the very edge of the Gobi Desert, they were granted a new home. The Han authorities, with their typical bureaucratic efficiency, designated a plot of land for them to build a new settlement. And in an act of remarkable, almost poetic, recognition, they gave the new county a special name. They called it Liqian. The name was significant. Liqian or Lite was the old Han Chinese name for the Roman Empire, likely a transliteration of Alexandria, the great Greco-Roman city in Egypt that was the western terminus of the maritime Silk Road. To name this new settlement Liqian was a direct acknowledgement of the strange, western origins of its inhabitants. It was a formal recognition that this was to be a Roman town in the heart of Han China. For the legionaries, the name was a bittersweet echo of a world they would never see again. It was a constant reminder of who they were, of the identity that had been all but erased by decades of exile. To hear their new home called by the Chinese word for Rome was a strange and poignant honor. It meant they were not entirely forgotten. It meant their story, their origin, had been preserved, even by their new masters. They were given tools, supplies, and the assistance of local laborers. The old centurions, their leadership instincts as sharp as ever, took charge. They laid out the new town not in the sprawling, organic style of a Chinese village, but with the familiar, disciplined geometry of a Roman military camp. They planned a grid of straight streets, a central square that served as a makeshift forum, and defensive earthworks that surrounded the settlement. The men who had spent their youths building fortified camps every night from Gaul to Syria now put those skills to use one last time, not for a single night's safety, but to build a permanent home. They worked with a renewed sense of purpose, a vigor they had not felt in decades. They were not just building a town, they were building a future. They were no longer prisoners or mercenaries. They were pioneers, founders of a new, unique community. The local Han Chinese population watched the construction with fascination. They saw the strange foreign men, with their loud guttural language and their peculiar building methods, raising a town that looked like nothing else in the region. They saw the efficiency, the discipline, and the sheer engineering skill of the former legionaries. A grudging respect, mixed with a healthy dose of curiosity, began to grow between the newcomers and the local inhabitants. The village of Liqian was becoming a reality, a tiny, improbable outpost of Roman culture on the far frontier of the Han Empire. The town of Liqian rose from the dust of the Gansu corridor, a living monument to the incredible journey of its founders. It was a place of profound and fascinating contradictions, a physical manifestation of the fused identities of the men who built it. The layout was Roman, a testament to the ingrained discipline and engineering prowess of the legionaries. The streets were straight, intersecting at right angles, a stark contrast to the winding lanes of nearby Chinese villages. At its heart was a central open space, a modest forum where the men would gather, their old habits of communal life persisting in this new land. The town was protected by a ditch and a heavy earthwork rampart, a scaled-down version of the fortifications that had once protected their legions every night. But the materials and architectural details were entirely Chinese. The buildings were not made of the stone and brick of Italy, but of the rammed earth and timber frames of Han China. The roofs were not flat or tiled in the Roman style, but were gently curved, with the distinctive overhanging eaves designed to provide shade in summer and shed the winter snows. The windows were not open squares, but were covered with delicate wooden latticework and oiled paper to keep out the biting wind of the Gobi. A traveler happening upon Liqian would have been baffled, seeing a town with a Roman soul but a Chinese body. This fusion extended to every aspect of life. The men, now settled and married to local Han women provided by the authorities, raised families that were a bridge between two empires. In the homes of Liqian, a father might teach his son how to hold a shield and stand in a battle line, using the old Latin words of command. Moments later, the boy's mother would call him to the evening meal in the local Chinese dialect, and he would eat with chopsticks, not a Roman spoon. The children grew up bilingual, bicultural, their very existence a blend of West and East. They inherited their father's European features, the rounder eyes, the higher-bridged noses which marked them as different from the other children in the region, a visible sign of their unique heritage. The legionaries fulfilled their duty. To the emperor, they established a garrison, training local recruits in their methods. They taught the principles of the testudo, the importance of the disciplined charge, and the techniques of building siege engines. They became a respected, if exotic, part of the Han frontier defense system. Their small town was a bastion of stability on a dangerous border, their Roman military skills now serving to protect the trade routes of the Silk Road. They adopted Chinese customs, celebrating the Lunar New Year alongside their own dimly remembered festivals like the Saturnalia. They learned to appreciate Chinese food, to drink tea, and to navigate the complex social hierarchies of their new society. Yet they held on to fragments of their past with a fierce, quiet tenacity. An old legionary might carve a small, crude eagle into the wooden post of his house, a secret, personal tribute to the lost standard of his youth. They would tell their children stories, not of the Yellow Emperor or the mythical dragons of China, but of the she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus, of the Punic Wars, and of the great Julius Caesar. These stories became the founding myths of Liqian, a private history passed down through the generations. The town was a testament to their resilience, their adaptability, and the enduring power of their original training. They had been defeated, captured, enslaved, and exiled. They had been marched to the end of the world and forced to fight in wars that were not their own. They had been captured a second time by an empire they never knew existed. And yet, they had not just survived, they had endured. They had built a new life, a new community, a strange and wonderful fusion of two of the world's greatest civilizations, a final improbable home for the lost legion. The sun was setting over the Liqian mountains, their jagged peaks painted in hues of orange, purple, and gold. It was a raw, majestic beauty, but it was not the beauty of home. An old man stood on the earthwork rampart of Liqian, leaning heavily on a wooden staff, his back to the small hybrid town he had helped build. His name might have been Lucius, or Marcus, or Gaius, but those names had not been spoken in decades. Here, he was known by a Chinese name, one given to him by his wife, a name his children and grandchildren could pronounce. He was one of the last, one of the few remaining men who could remember the tramp of Carrhae on a Roman road, the taste of Italian wine, the sight of the 7 hills across the Tiber. He was nearly 70 years old, his body a roadmap of a life that defied belief. His skin was like tanned leather, weathered by the suns of Syria, Parthia, and now the high deserts of Gansu. His eyes, a pale watery blue that was still a novelty in this land, were clouded with age, but they still held the ghost of a unflinching gaze. His hands, gnarled and arthritic, were the same hands that had once gripped a pilum, built a siege ramp, and held the shield in the fish-scale line at the Battle of Carrhae. He looked west, his gaze fixed on the point where the setting sun touched the horizon. It was a ritual he had performed for as long as he could remember. West was the direction of home. For years that westward gaze had been filled with a desperate, painful longing, a hope of return that had slowly, cruelly withered, and died. Then, for many more years, it had been a look of bitter memory, of anger and loss. Now, it was something else. It was quieter, more distant, like looking at a landscape in a dream. What was Rome to him now? It was not a place he could ever see again. It was a collection of faint, disjointed images. The face of his mother, now so blurry he could barely hold it in his mind. The smell of the sea at Brundisium. The roar of the crowd in the forum, a sound he had heard only as a boy. He remembered the arrogant confidence of the march out of Syria, the glittering eagles, the belief that they were invincible. It all felt like a story he had been told about someone else, a young, foolish man who had died long ago in the desert. His life had been defined by two empires. He had been born a citizen of the first, a cog in its mighty war machine, and he would die a subject of the second, a respected elder in a remote frontier town. He had seen the pride of Rome shattered in the dust of Carrhae, and he had witnessed the disciplined power of the Han as they tore down the walls of Carrhae. He had stood in the presence of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and he had stood a captive before the dragon throne of the Son of Heaven. Who else in the world could claim such a life? It was a fate of such epic, tragic improbability that it felt less like a life lived and more like a myth. A small hand slipped into his was his granddaughter, her face a perfect, beautiful fusion of his Roman features and her grandmother's Han Chinese ancestry. She looked up at him, her dark eyes full of concern, and spoke to him in the local dialect. "Grandfather," she said softly, "the evening meal is ready. Grandmother is waiting." He looked down at her, and the hard lines on his face softened. He saw in her face, not the past, not the loss, but the future. He saw the legacy of his survival. His life had not been for nothing. He had endured. He had founded a family. He had helped build this town. His blood, Roman blood, would now flow for generations in this strange, distant land, a single, faint tributary into the great river of the Han people.